Chronicles of the War of Souls book series. Book 1 Lyrael, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 9. First Blood. The company moved among weeping willows, their long, mournful curtain of petals so dense and heavy it seemed to absorb all sound, leaving only a deafening, oppressive hum in the ears. The air here was thick and damp, like warm tree sap, and the light, straining through the dense, dark foliage, shattered into thousands of tiny emerald droplets that fell upon the damp earth and the traveler's shoulders as trembling, living spots. 10 shadows in cloaks the color of soaked earth and tarnished leaves trod the springy, velvety moss without a sound, quieter than the autumn spiderwebs that drift slowly onto the rotten forest floor. They did not walk, they flowed between moss-covered, hoary trunks like fear itself, spilled beyond the borders of Lendern, heavy and relentless as a leaden pre-storm sky ready to burst open at any moment. At the forefront, parting the dense twilight with her motion, was Lyrael, her figure, tall and slender, in a cloak bleached to the pale hue of ash and moonlight, seemed the point of a honed arrow aimed at the very heart of the encroaching dark. The features of her face, sharp and clear as a forest predator's, were strained to the limit, as if carved from cold, immobile marble, and in her eyes, deep and gray as lake water before a storm, lay the peculiar, centuries-accumulated weariness known only to those who have stared too long and too intently into the pitiless face of ruin. Over her light back rested a bough of smooth, milky white ash, and at her hip, in worn sheaths, hung a long blade, straight, thin, and unerring as despair's final argument, gleaming in the half-light like the cold grin of a star. Behind her, moving with an innate, almost feral grace that stilled the hearts of the forest's creatures, came the others, and they were 9. 9 pairs of eyes that reflected not a simple, fleeting sadness, but a heavy, nurtured in silence resolve, ripening slowly as venom and yielding, in the end, bitter, bloody fruit. Aylar, tall and silent as a crag, whose numerous scars gleamed on pale skin like phantom traces from the invisible claws of fate itself, and in his bearing, in every motion, one read the immovable, unshakable firmness of granite. Beside him, moving like a shadow, was Iviel, with hair the color of ripe honey and a gaze full of quiet, unspoken sorrow that settles on the soul like slow, certain poison, as autumn fog devours fields. The twins, Fenrir and Lyrael, the first with eyes burning like coals, dancing with untamed demons of wrath and impatience, the second, cold, detached, and focused, as if carved from the ice of eternal winter, and the silence between them was thicker and more impenetrable than the deepest forest thicket. The old tracker Halder, whose face resembled an old, fissured map where each wrinkle was a trail blazed in darkness, and at the corners of his thin, compressed lips was etched the bitterness of 1,000 lonely night forays. The young archers Sinil and Ryniel, whose youth, like the first tender leaf of spring, only emphasized the deadly seriousness of which their slender, long fingers gripped the dark, top curves of their bows. Bringing up the rear were the 2 guards, the massive, gnarled Tarlin, stout as an old oak root, whose mail shirt gave a muted, gut-deep clink with each heavy step, and the supple Orlin, lithe as a willow branch, bearing on their shoulders not only their bows but long, stern spears, whose tips glinted dully, like the eyes of a dying fish, in the scant, deceptive light. The air here still smells of home, Iviel whispered, her voice usually melodious as a stream over smooth stones, now like the sad rustle of a wilting, falling leaf. But there's a bitterness in it now, as if ashes from a distant, foreign fire have settled on our own threshold. Lyrael did not turn, made not the slightest movement of her head, but her shoulders, already taut as her bowstring, tightened a fraction more, betraying the inner strain. She heard not just the words, but what lay at their very core, the same cold, gnawing fear that chewed at her from within, insistent and ruthless as water wearing down stone. She remembered the familiar, warm lights of Lendern, the cozy scent of fresh bread and baked apples, and that black, silent shadow that fell over it all, the shadow that had forced them to abandon their hearths and walk towards something unknown, ancient, and merciless as the very earth beneath their feet. She felt the weight of every gaze fixed on her, back trust, mute expectation, hidden dread. This was a burden far heavier than any gear, heavier even than the steel mail the warriors bore. Aylar, walking a few silent paces behind her, saw the almost imperceptible tremor in Lyrael's slender fingers resting on the familiar sword hilt. He knew it was not fear of the coming fight. He carried the same unbearable heaviness in his own soul, the weight of responsibility for those who walked behind. trusting him with their lives. His own scars, those silvery, phantom traces on pale skin, seemed to burn with a living reminder of all the battles he had already endured, and of those yet to come in the hazy future. He thought of how fragile and deceptive the beauty of this old forest was, and how easily, like a spider web, it could be swallowed and torn by the darkness closing in from all sides, against which they were but 10 pale, weary shadows. The ashes of others' fires. Halder uttered hoarsely, his voice like the groan of an old, mighty tree in the wind. He did not turn his head. His gaze, clouded with memory, was fixed ahead into the very thick of the green, deceitful tangle, and his old, keen eyes, which had seen too much in their long span, seemed to discern in it more than just intertwined branches and trunks. Such ashes have a way of smothering their own hearths, and their smell, foreign and bitter, seeps into clothing, into the skin itself, into the soul. You cannot wash it away, not with water nor with blood. Fenner, walking slightly off the main path so that the crunch of twigs under his boot sounded a challenge to the general silence, clenched the carved hilt of his dagger until the knuckles of his broad palm whitened, as if carved from marble. The anger that always slumbered deep within him, in the darkest depths of his being, stir, a hot, living serpent ready to strike. He hated this suffocating silence, this agonizing weight, this bitter taste of ash on the tongue that Iviel spoke of. He ached for action fierce, swift, and decisive to cut through this clinging, resin-like veil of anxiety at the steel edge, to drown the forest's sinister whisper with cleansing fire. His sister, Lyrael, seemed the very embodiment of that silence, its cold and rational kin. Her clear, merciless gaze, devoid of all fire, slid slowly across the shadowed clearings between trees, calculating, assessing, finding in every twig, every suspicious bend of the gnarled path a possible ambush or trap invisible to the others. Her calm was an icy, impervious shield behind which she carefully hid the same gnawing anxiety that tormented the others' hearts. The young elves, Seniel and Ryniel, walked in hushed quiet, listening not only to the elders' words, but to every rustle, every tremor of a leaf. For them, this journey was the first true trial, a baptism smelling not of clean water, but of blood and cold earth, and the sweetish, cloying taste of fear on their youthful tongues mingled with the bitter, metallic taste of duty. They felt the springy, soft moss under their light feet, saw the living light playing and shimmering in the emerald canopy overhead, and with an aching clarity understood that they might be seeing all this wordless, ancient beauty for the last time. That thought was sharp and cold as the tempered steel of their own, as yet, untested blades. Tarlin shifted his feet heavily, with a bear-like tread, and his armor, heavy mail rings, emitted a muffled, gut-deep clanking, like an underground chime disrupting the ringing, crystalline silence of the forest. He bore his heroic strength as he would bear a heavy, unbreakable shield, ready at any moment to put his broad back between any danger and the company. Orlin, by contrast, moved so lightly and smoothly he seemed not to touch the ground at all, but merely to glide over it. His eyes, keen and watchful as a forest bird's, darted constantly from side to side, searching for the slightest movement, the tiniest, barely perceptible sign of hidden threat in the seemingly sleeping, serene forest. Aylar, without turning his lion-like head, responded to the quiet words with his low, hollow voice, like distant, subterranean thunder foretelling a storm in the high mountains, thunder rising not from the sky, but from the very depths. Our threshold is no more. Iviel, the crack in the tree is not just a wound in the bark, it is a rift in the world itself, in the very fabric of being. The whole forest has fallen silent, listening to the alien darkness seeping from it like smoke, and every leaf, every blade of grass trembles from that silent, poisonous streaming. And what does it hear? Tell me, burst from Fenner, his strained voice ringing with a tightly drawn string of tense, unspoken fury. His long fingers, nervously and aimlessly plucking at his bow's taut string, were white and strained at the joints. A new madness falling from the heavens? Or just the great, all-consuming silence that follows the very end? Lyrael slowly turned, and her gaze, cold and clear as a solitary winter star in the black heights, swept over her companions, probing, scanning each pale face, reading each secret, hidden thought. In that look was neither condemnation nor feeble comfort, only the hard, steely clarity of the duty laid upon her shoulders. We do not walk to meet the end, Fenner. We walk to the very source of the sickness, to that black root that has poisoned the dreams of the whole world, whispering to us from beyond the thin edge of reality. Our task is to find this poison, to dig down to its source. And may its bitterness be more bitter than wormwood and hotter than the fiercest fire. The young Cineal, setting foot beyond the invisible barrier of his home for the first time in his life, asked timidly, almost inaudibly, and his voice, not yet hardened to a man's firmness, shook and trembled like a solitary leaf in a sudden gust of wind. And what if we are already too late, if that poison has penetrated too deep, into the most secret roots, and the souls of the ancient trees are already poisoned, already rotting from its sweet pus? Then old Halder spoke, his voice like the ancient, unhurried creak of age-old branches rubbing together in a long spell of bad weather, a voice that held the memory of 1,000 dawns and sunsets, of the change of countless seasons. The forest dies not as men do, child. It can lie in oblivion for centuries, whole ages, with a heart seemingly blackened through and then give a single, fragile sprout that will overturn the very earth, piercing the thickest stone of despair. We are that very sprout, fragile, green, and full of stubborn life. They went on, deeper and deeper into the very heart of the eternal, endless forest. And with every step, the living arches of intertwined branches closed tighter and more impenetrably above their heads. Giant ferns, like frozen emerald fountains, bowed over them, dropping heavy droplets of icy dew like tears of nature itself onto their shoulders and hoods, the water trickling down their collars and making their skin shiver from the unexpected cold. The mighty branches of ancient oaks, grown over with lichen as gray as an elder's beard, wove above them into intricate, Gothic vaults, creating the sensation of a majestic cathedral born of nature itself, hallowed by a silent and dreadful holiness. The air was thick with the pungent aromas of pine needles, damp, decaying earth, and rotting tree trunks, and ancient, complex perfume mingling the sense of life and death. Lyrael walked ahead, and in her ears, over the ringing, sepulchral silence of the mountains, sounded ceaselessly that very silent, yet painfully palpable cry emanating from the cracking creation itself, from the wound in the world tree. It had become the internal tuning fork of their whole desperate mission, the sole measure of their shared despair and their last, laughably fragile hope, smoldering like a lonely spark in impenetrable darkness. She turned, casting a look at her 9 companions, non-living shades of the same elven fate, 9 separate rays gathered into a single beam to pierce the encroaching dark, and she physically felt the weight of their souls lying upon her shoulders, like the weight of separate, yet unwritten chapters in the same ancient, endless book. They were not an army clanging with steel and banners. They were the living, breathing embodiment of Lendorn's last will, the final, desperate question posed by a dying world into the face of silent fate. And the forest itself, seeming to hold its breath, saw them off into the advancing twilight, and in its deep, pregnant silence lay far more meaning and bitter warning than in any, even the wisest, words. The company moved east along an ancient, nearly faded elven path that wound among colossal, time-hoary trees like a snake seeking the true way. With each new day, the air grew drier and sharper, acquiring a resinous, coniferous bite and a barely perceptible, cold, lifeless scent of stone, the scent of eternity and oblivion. The dragon ridges, until recently merely a blue, blurred phantom on the very edge of the horizon, now loomed over the last trees as a grim, inaccessible gray wall, casting sharp, deep shadows that fell upon the earth like blows from a giant's axe. The path grows steeper, the stone crumbles underfoot. Halder noted, his keen, experienced gaze peering at the rocky outcrops ahead, searching for familiar marks. We are drawing near the very foothills. Soon the last oak will be behind us, and we will be left alone with bare stone. Iviel walked, slightly lagging behind the others, her melancholy gaze sweeping over the steep slopes overgrown with low, gnarled, wine-worn pines. Can you feel how the very air has changed? It has grown harsher, cuts the throat. Smells of icy wind from the peaks and ancient, untouched dust. This, perhaps, is how the great dragons breathed in ancient times, as they slept in their stone dens. Fenrir, leaping lightly over a dried-up, jagged stream crossing the path, turned to her, his swarthy face showing undisguised discontent. I much prefer the thick, living scent of the forest, but here it feels as if the very stone, every fragment of it, watches you without feeling, unwelcoming and hostile. Lyrael, ever practical and reserved, silently adjusted the bow on her back, checking the tension of the string. Watching or not, each of us must climb. The southern pass lies somewhere ahead, beyond the next bend, and we must find the very start of the ascent before the daylight begins to fade. They walked on, not slowing their pace, and the path, which until recently had been cushioned with soft pine needles and a carpet of ferns, now wound among increasingly frequent and stable scree slopes, paved with ancient, polished stone worn smooth by countless feet and winds. The trees slowly but surely retreated, growing lower, stunted, and sparser, while the air grew thin and cold, as if frozen by the eternal, piercing winds that roamed tirelessly among the naked peaks of the dragon ridges. The sun, no longer held back by the dense, kindly canopy of leaves, no longer warmed their backs gently, but shone blindingly and mercilessly, reflecting off the blind gray cliffs, each ray burning the skin like the point of a thin, icy needle. The forest remained far below, a dark green, boundless sea murmuring a barely audible, lulling surf, while here, on the ascent, stone reigned supreme, eternal, silent, indifferent, and full of hidden threat. Lyrael walked ahead, her clear gaze fixed on the stern ridge barring their way like a wall. She felt not only the landscape changing around them, but something within themselves, the soft, poetic forest sorrow fading, replaced, like steel from a forge, by the grim, ascetic resolve of mountain travelers doomed to a hard road. Here, at a rocky fork, one path, wide and well-tended, confidently led south, skirting the mountain's base, while another, narrow, forgotten, and sinister, wound upward like a faint serpent into the very heart of the stone giants. And we are not going south, along the very foothills, and then through the marble gates. Young Cineal asked in a trembling voice, undisguised anxiety in his eyes as he looked at the looming cliff. Everyone says that way, though many weeks longer, is far safer. At least, there's no risk of falling into a bottomless chasm or meeting in the rock something worse than griffins. Lyrael slowly turned. The wind, whistling through the gorges, fiercely tossed her silver, moon-bright hair. And in her eyes, the color of spring sky after a storm, lay that same unshakable resolve that had made all of Lendern listen to her words. She did not answer immediately, letting her calm, all-seeing gaze sweep over the pale, tense faces of her companions, seeing in them the living reflection of her own doubts and fears, suppressed by iron will. No. Her words sounded clear and sharp, cutting through the wind's howl. We go straight, over the Dragon Ridge Pass. The road will be perilous, but faster, weeks faster, and that may prove decisive. She made a small pause, letting them all grasp the full weight of this decision, then continued, and in her melodious voice now rang steel, unbending notes born not of arrogance, but of cold, jealous calculation and grim necessity. Every day, every moment of our delay could be the last for those who remain there. Beyond these mountains, Lyrael corrected herself, and in her voice now sounded not the former certainty, but a deep, hard-worn anxiety familiar to anyone who carries others' lives upon their shoulders. We do not know what is happening now in the east. From Lendern we saw only black smoke and sorrowful shadows of foreign suffering. But is that not enough already? To hasten, sparing no strength. She slowly looked over her companions, and in her gray, deep eyes was read the same tormenting, gnawing bewilderment that had torn at all their souls these long days, draining them dry as sand in an hourglass. The marble gates, her gaze, heavy and intent, swept over the southern path leading into safe distance. There, we would have not a single chance to slip east unseen, like shadows. The wind, sharp and gusty, carried from the east a pungent, elusive scent of burning faint, barely detectable, yet relentless and insistent as a sea tide carrying shipwrecked debris ashore. But here, on the pass, no one expects us, she finished quietly, almost a whisper, and her words hung in the icy air. And in a world where stars themselves fall from the sky, this is perhaps the only pitiful advantage we still possess. The pass, an old, forgotten dwarf trail. There were rumors it was completely buried by a rockfall centuries ago, entombing several travelers. Aylar Rast, having remained silent until now. Rumors or not, Lyrael countered, and at the very corners of her pale, cracked lips trembled a shadow of what in other times might have passed for a smile. Had her face held even a drop of past mirth? That the stones, Aylar, remember something else. And I remember too. I remember those ancient maps that gathered dust in the darkest corners of the great library. Maps drawn in the times of trade with the dwarves of Ganabar. A path exists. It is dangerous. It demands a heart that does not flinch, and feet that do not slip for a single moment. But it exists. She turned decisively and took the first, unerring step onto the narrow, serpentine trail. The stone under her foot, rough and uneven, felt surprisingly warm, almost alive. having soaked in all the sun's heat during the long day. That this warmth was deceptive and fleeting, it could not drive away the penetrating, icy breath of the heights that already began to scrape over the skin with tiny, invisible needles. The trail was no wider than to adult elves' shoulders, and to their right loomed a gray, blind cliff wall, rough and in places damp with moisture seeping from cracks, while to their left gaped a frightening emptiness falling away into a smoky, milky haze of the valley lying far, far below. Every pebble, every fragment of stone dislodged from under a foot and rolling down with a quiet, dry clatter to vanish, without trace, in the abyss, made the heart contract into a brief, painful knot. They walked, pressing their backs and shoulders against the cold, uneven surface of the cliff, feeling its rough breath on their cheeks. Their gray cloaks fluttered tremulously behind them like anxious, silent banners rippling in the wind. The scent around had changed finally and irrevocably. Now it was the pure, almost sterile and lifeless smell of dizzying height, mixed with fine stone dust, bitter wormwood, and something else, ancient and metallic, as if the very air here was saturated with the slumbering, measured breath of great dragons sleeping in the darkest bowels of the mountains. The sun, enormous and crimson, slowly sank toward sunset, flooding the cliffs and chasms with fiery, deep crimson and golden hues, and this dazzling, almost unbearable beauty only served to sharpen the danger of their path. They were silent, conserving every scrap of breath and every drop of strength, and in this sepulchral silence, broken only by the mournful wail of wind in the crevices, each thought their own thoughts, of the warmth of forever left sunlit groves, the quiet, lulling whisper of Lendorn streams, of the unknown awaiting them on the other, dark side of the ridge, in lands where stars have fallen from the sky and from where the morning wind blows, carrying on its wings bitter ashes and hopeless despair. The sun, like a red-hot ball from an ancient, forgotten elven legend, slowly and inexorably rolled behind the sharp, jagged horizon of the Dragon Ridge. Long, grotesquely beautiful and distorted shadows crept from deep crevices and began to crawl slowly over the crumbling slopes, merging into a single, lilac, thick veil of approaching night. The air, until recently burning and thin, cooled rapidly, almost visibly, acquiring a piercing, burning sharpness of broken ice. The wind, a faithful and unchanging companion of these heights, shifted from a nagging, shrieking current to a low, menacing howl, promising a fierce night frost that would bind the stones. To go farther along this crumbling, unreliable ledge overhanging the black abyss in the swiftly thickening twilight would be pure suicide, obvious and indisputable as a death sentence read aloud. Lyrael, whose face had grown pale as snow on the peaks and gaunt from long strain and piercing cold, stopped on a tiny, barely noticeable ledge where the path widened slightly, forming a sort of stone palm extended right to the edge of the chasm. She turned to the company stretched out behind her, and in her eyes, weary to the depths of her soul, but not having lost their habitual, piercing clarity, was read a heavy, hard-won decision, born not of cold calculation but of the raw, animal instinct for survival that beats in the heart of every living creature. "Here," she uttered, and her voice, torn by a gust of wind, barely reached her companions, becoming a hoarse whisper drowning in the howl of the void. "No farther. Tonight, these mountains belong not to us, but to the wind and the advancing shadow alone." The spot chosen for the night's rest was neither a hospitable shelter nor a welcome haven. It was a forced, dangerous respite, a temporary reprieve on the very brink between life and imminent death. On one side loomed a gray, rough cliff face, still holding in its deep pores the scant daytime warmth. On the other gaped a bottomless emptiness, filled now not with the dazzling radiance of valleys, but with deepening, almost black-purple gloom. The small platform was littered with sharp, razor-like stone fragments, and the elves had to clear space for the night in complete, oppressive silence, conserving every movement, pushing rubble with the soles of their sturdy, worn boots toward the silent precipice, listening to the long, swelling, then fading sound of falling somewhere in the impenetrable depths. They worked in silence, with that concentrated, almost animal economy of effort characteristic of creatures whose lives depend on every breath, every considered step. Aylar and Old Halder, the most experienced trackers, examined every dark crevice in the stone, every suspicious outcrop, searching for the slightest signs of life, traces of venomous scorpions or lurking snakes' nests. But the mountains kept a dead, sepulchral silence. It seemed the very stone flesh of the earth had long died out in these parts, leaving behind only the bare, lifeless essence of eternal cold and solitude. They kindled, not an ordinary fire. There was decidedly nothing to burn in this emptiness, and a bright flame would inevitably betray their presence, but a quiet magical fire. Iviel, whose long fingers seemed as delicate and fragile as night flower petals, carefully extracted from her travel pouch a smooth, polished sunstone, warm to the touch as a living body. Placing it in the center of their tight circle, she touched its rough surface with her fingertips and whispered a few ancient, melodious sounds like the rustle of dry leaves underfoot in a sleeping forest. The stone responded with an even, dim, but extraordinarily steady glow, resembling the light of a lone, distant star lost in the night mist. It gave no real warmth but drove away the bone-piercing dampness and illuminated their wretched camp with a ghostly radiance in which their pale, weary faces looked like masks carved from old, yellowed ivory. They ate sparingly, without any joy, as befits those who have voluntarily forsaken comfort and peace for grim duty. From their travel pouches, they extracted hard loaves of baked grain and dried berries, tough as sea pebbles yet capable of staving off hunger. They had brought no meat. The very flesh of slain beasts was for them a coarse, barbaric reminder of mortality, from which they had long ago turned away in their songs. Instead, they each took a few sips of water from their leather flasks, mixed with a few drops of pure essence of sundew, an ancient elven draught that restored strength and spirit better than any sleep. Its taste was astringent, slightly bitter, with a lingering aftertaste of pine needles and distant, forever lost flowering meadows of Lendern, and each swallow echoed in the soul as a sharp, aching homesickness for lost peace. They settled, tucking weary legs beneath them, on cloaks spread on the cold stone, trying not to look into the gaping, beckoning blackness of the chasm that began right at their feet. Their silence was not empty but thick, heavy, saturated with unspoken thoughts and dark anxieties. Fenner, his usually burning, coal-like gaze now dull and tired, unconsciously, nervously plucked at his bow's taut string, and across his gaunt face flitted shadows of past, unspent rage mingled with a new, unfamiliar, and humiliating feeling, fear of the indifferent, overwhelming majesty of the mountains. Lyrael sat utterly motionless as a stone statue, her cold, refined beauty seeming even more fragile and unnatural in the ghostly, deathly light of the sunstone. She stared at the stars, lighting one by one in the velvet black sky, but their pattern, alien and unfamiliar, was hostile and silent to her. In Lendern, Iviel began quietly, as if afraid to startle the fragile, spiderweb thin thread of memory. At this very time, they are already lighting glow lanterns in the branches of the white ash, and singing the old songs, those very ones our ancestors made, about how the first streams were born at the dawn of the world. Her voice faltered, broke off, and fell silent, finally crushed by the immense weight of night and the unimaginable distance that now lay between them and home. Now there is the crack there, Aylar muttered gloomily through clenched teeth, not looking at her. He sat hunched, his powerful arms wrapped around his knees, and his broad back seemed yet another stern cliff in this soulless stone kingdom. And they are singing, I imagine, quite different songs now, songs of the great, all-consuming silence. Lyrael, sitting slightly apart from the tight circle in the shadow of a rocky outcrop, listened not to their quiet, fragmented conversation, but to that very voice that sounded only in the depths of her consciousness, that same silent, yet obsessive drone that had become their guiding star leading into nowhere. It was a little weaker here in the mountains, muffled by the enormous, oppressive thickness of stone, but no less insistent or tolerable for that. It was like a deep, relentless itch in a bone once broken, a constant, throbbing, familiar pain that grows into one's very nature and becomes an inseparable part of you. She looked at her companions, frozen in the sunstone's light, these non-living souls who had entrusted their lives and their deepest doubts to her without reserve, and she physically felt the icy weight of that responsibility, cold, sharp, and relentless as a shard of mountain ice in the heart. They were the last, most fragile offspring of a fading Lender, its swan song whispered into the face of the approaching storm, and now she led them not toward glory or victory, but perhaps straight into the very black heart of darkness, to meet something that had neither name, nor form, nor a drop of mercy in its fathomless essence. Old Halder, slowly smacking his lips, finished his hard loaf and washed it down with a long gulp from his flask. His aged butt and dimmed eyes, like tarnished gemstones, slowly surveyed their miserable, wine-battered refuge with the familiar look of a seasoned tracker, who had seen more than his share of such camps on the edge of the world. Sleep while you can. His voice was like the creak of old wood, The night in these mountains is always shorter than it seems to a frightened heart, and tomorrow's path will be no easier, only steeper. I will take the first watch. My sleep, like that of an old, much-seen badger, is light and shallow. One by one, silently and submissively, wrapped in their grey, worn cloaks and pressing their backs to the cliff that still held the day's warmth, the elves sought elusive oblivion, though they knew it was impossible. Sleep under such conditions was not rest or healing, but a forced, temporary shutdown of consciousness, a brief, stolen respite for the exhausted body, while the soul itself remained vigilant, listening keenly to every rustle of stone, the howling wind in crevices, and their own unspoken fears stirring in the dark. Seniel and Ryniel settled next to each other, shoulder to shoulder, and their youthful, smooth faces, now devoid of even a shadow of their former serene joy, seemed in their troubled half-slumber weary, frightened, and childishly vulnerable. Lyrael closed her eyes last, laying her heavy head on a small, hard bundle of supplies. Through the thin cloak fabric, she distinctly felt every irregularity of the cold, lifeless stone, every roughness, every tiny, sharp protrusion. It was an uncomfortable, hard, and cold bed, but it was an inseparable part of the path they had chosen for themselves, and in that awareness lay its own, bitter and stern, wormwood bitter meaning. Before her mind's eye drifted troubling images: the white tree with its black, gaping crack, the phantom boy with a silent scream on his lips, and falling, dying stars, merging into a single chaotic, agonizing kaleidoscope. She thought of words once spoken by wise Quendeler, of a riverbed and water, and now it seemed to her that they all were not water, but those very falling, solitary stars, torn from their familiar, eternal pattern and flying into black unknown, either to vanish without trace or to illuminate for a moment something important and terrible in the utter darkness. And this thought, strangely, brought no comfort, but gave birth in her a cold, clear, mountain air calm of resigned acceptance of her fate. The howling wind slowly merged with the dull whisper of her own blood in her ears, and gradually, despite the piercing cold, gnawing fear, and stone bed, a heavy, troubled sleep began to envelop her consciousness, carrying her into the vague realm of shadows where even the eternal stars kept silence, listening to what was happening in the world below. Dawn in the mountains did not arrive. It was stolen, like a coin purse from a sleeping traveler. Gray, leaden, monotonous haze slowly but surely displaced the thick blackness of night, bringing neither desired warmth nor the slightest comfort. The wind, that eternal and relentless master of the high pass, had not abated overnight but merely changed its tone. From a menacing, mournful howl, it shifted to a furious, incessant, blind squall that tore the last remnants of warmth from their faces, lashed exposed skin with thin, invisible needles of icy dust, and forced even the elves, children of air and forest freedom, to walk bent over, heads drawn into tense shoulders, like wretched travelers trudging through an invisible yet painfully tangible wall of lead and cold. The trail, barely visible in daylight, now, in this gray haze, seemed to vanish entirely, dissolving into fog and rock. It snaked along the very edges of ledges, sometimes narrowing to the width of a single foot, and every new step required silent, desperate negotiation with the blind elements, a balancing act on the very brink of life and oblivion. The stone underfoot, frozen through during the long night, became slippery, treacherous, and unreliable. The wind furiously tore at their cloaks, turning them into fluttering sails, and tried to sweep them into the gaping chasm, and they walked, clinging to the rough, icy surface of the cliff with almost bare fingers, feeling the freezing, searing cold slowly penetrate through the thin skin of their gloves and sink into the very bones. They moved like a ghostly, silent procession, inscribed into the stern, eternal landscape of infinity. Lyrael walked ahead, her thin figure in the faded cloak seeming even more fragile and yet unbending as steel wire. She did not look back. All her will, all her being, was concentrated on the few slippery meters of path ahead, on the desperate search for any foothold, any tiniest crack for tenacious fingers. Behind her, breathing heavily and hoarsely, came Aelor, his massive, powerful frame a living anchor for all those behind, a mute shield against the fiercest, staggering gusts of icy wind. He uttered not a single word, but his hollow, ragged breathing was as integral a sound of their difficult path as the eternal, mournful wail of the elements. The stone is breathing," young Seniel whispered through teeth clenched with strain, barely audible, yet in the ringing, piercing silence of shared despair, His words, like sharp shards, reached Lyrael. "It's moving, I can feel it right under my foot." This was no metaphor, no trick of overwrought imagination. Wind of such inhuman force did not merely blow, it made everything around vibrate, shuddering in continuous convulsion, and the small stones littering the narrow path trembled and rolled down with a dry, bone-like, final clatter, fading somewhere in the depths. It seemed the ancient mountains themselves, these stone giants, were shuddering to their very foundations from this blind, relentless onslaught. Iviel, walking behind him, tried to shield her pale face with the edge of her thick cloak, but the icy, invisible needles of dust found the tiniest chinks, painfully biting into tender skin, leaving tiny, stinging wounds. Her lungs, accustomed to the most fragrant, thick air of her native forest, convulsively tightened from this thin, prickly, meager mixture of pure cold and all-shattering wind. Every new breath was for her a small, exhausting battle that had to be won again and again. "Hold on, tighter." Her voice was instantly torn and shredded by the wind. The fragment of phrase carried away without trace into the gaping chasm. "It's just wind. It will end someday." But the wind, this madman, had no intention of ending. It only grew, reaching new, frenzied, demonic power with each minute. It howled now with a low, gut-deep bass, a rumble seeming to come from the very darkest bowels of a world arrayed against them. Tiny and audacious, the trail suddenly made a sharp, dangerous turn, emerging onto an open, unprotected, smooth slope. And here the squall struck them in all its unbridled fury. It was no longer just a wall, but a solid, dense mass of moving, furious air, blinding, deafening, leaving not the slightest gap for thoughts, only for the raw, animal instinct of survival. Lyrael froze, pressing her backhand palms against the cold cliff. Unable to take a single step forward in this dance of death, she turned to check on the company through the veil of icy dust, and her heart clenched into a knot of icy horror. They stood, pressed into the stone wall, their figures bent, looking pitiful and helpless before the face of the enraged, all-crushing elements. Their cloaks fluttered and slapped against them like convulsively beating hearts in agony. Fenner, his face distorted with extreme strain, desperately tried to take a step, but the wind, as if alive and evil, hurled him back like a light splinter. He barely kept his balance on the edge, driving whitened fingers into a tiny, unreliable protrusion. His sister, Lyrael, silently, with effort, stretched a hand toward him, but the distance between them, just a couple of desperate steps, suddenly seemed an insurmountable, vast chasm. "Ropes!" Halder croaked, and his torn voice cut through the continuous roar of the elements with unexpected force. "Tie yourselves, now." They acted quickly, silently, with that polished precision, as if honed by years of harsh training. Tarlin and Orlin, the strongest and steadiest, first attached long, thin, yet incredibly strong elven ropes, tightly woven from fibers of silver spider silk and mountain goat sinew, to their sturdy belts. They tossed the free ends to the others, who, with fingers nearly numb from piercing cold, tied complex, time-tested knots with difficulty but certainty. Old Halder, with slow, bear-like but precise movements, helped the trembling Cineal and Riniel, muttering something disjointed and soothing under his breath, like an old, forgotten lullaby. Now bound into a single, fragile, yet living chain, they moved forward again, slowly and cautiously. This was no longer a procession, but an incredibly tortuous crawl along the very wall of the world. On the edge of doom, the wind furiously tore between their bodies, trying to break this thin living thread, swinging them like pendulums over the black, gaping void. Every step Lyrael took, every sigh, echoed immediately in the tension of the rope trailing behind her and binding her movements. She felt them all: Cineal's cold, clammy fear, Fenner's furious, blind stubbornness, Aylar's weary, dogged resolve, Lyrael's icy, detached concentration like heavy, invisible weights on her own belt, like a part of herself, her own flesh and will. They moved like that for what seemed an eternity, measured not in minutes, but in the number of steps taken, each one bargained for with death. Leg and back muscles burned with fire, lungs tore from lack of vital air, and ears were filled with a continuous, deafening drone that drove out all thought. And then, when it seemed this utter hell would have no end, the battered trail ducked again under a protective overhanging cornice, into a narrow, dark, maw-like tunnel, seemingly punched by wind's very fury into the thickness of the unyielding cliff. The howl of the elements here became muffled, distant, like a voice behind a thick, soundproof door. The pressure squeezing their chests finally eased. They found themselves in a stone sack, a long, low, but life-saving crevice where, for the first time in many hours, they could stand fully upright. The air here was still, cold, smelling of ancient dry dust and a faint, sharp scent of ozone. As after a close thunderstorm, no one uttered a word. Words at this moment seemed sacrilege. Unnecessary tow bells disrupting the solemnity of shared exhaustion. They looked at Lyrael, and in their sunken, weary eyes was read not just blind trust, but something far greater, a silent and final acknowledgement of her will, her choice. She, like a dark angel, was leading them through the very hell, and they, against all logic, were still alive, feeling cold sweat on their backs and trembling in weakened legs. Her own heart pounded somewhere in her throat, heavily and rapidly, and her legs quivered from overexertion, as if filled with lee. Darely nodding, Lyrael ran a hand in its thin, soaped glove over her face, brushing off the encrusted icy sleet, and fixed her gaze into the depths of the tunnel, into the thickening, almost tangible darkness that lurked ahead. "Catch your breath," she uttered, and her wine-torn voice sounded hoarse, uncharacteristically loud and coarse in the ensuing tomb-like silence. "But not for long. Remember, this is not the end of the road." The silence that reigned in their stone, unreliable den was akin to that ominous halt that occurs in the very heart of a storm, fragile, deceptive, and ready to explode into a new furious vortex at any moment. Beyond the thick cliff walls, the wind continued its insane, endless song, and its muffled yet furious howls now resembled the voice of a maddened giant vainly and angrily trying to break through to them, to tear away this fragile roof over their heads. The elves, leaning their backs against the rough, death-cold surface of stone, surrendered to this short, stolen respite, greedily inhaling air thick with the scent of ancient dust and raw, dank stone. Their lungs, accustomed to the pure, coniferous aromas of Lendern, accepted this sterile, icy emptiness of the highlands with difficulty and pain. And it was in this moment of deceptive calm, when their bodies still remember every muscle fiber clenched by the unbearable strain of the crossing, and their souls began to thaw, like wounds, that it happened the thing each had feared even to think aloud. Young Siniel, whose pale, frightened face still bore the living imprint of recent horror, took an incautious, impulsive step, wanting to shift and yield more space to the exhausted Iviel. His foot, stiff from long cold and fatigue, suddenly slipped on a wet, time-polished ledge. He had no time to make a sound, not even a cry, only a short, choked exhalation, like the groan of a wounded bird, escaped his constricted chest and was immediately swallowed by the cavernous, indifferent echo of the tunnel, and he fell, not forward, but backward, toward that same dreadful, black exit leading into the embrace of the all-consuming chasm. His body, light and graceful, struck a sharp rocky crest of the cornice with a dull, bony thud, hung for an instant in an absurd, unnatural curve, and vanished over the jagged edge, dragged down by the merciless, inexorable force of gravity. The rope, the thought, sharp and clear as a honed blade, pierced Lyrael's consciousness. He was tied. But before this feeble, trembling hope could even be born in her heart, it was replaced by a soul-chilling, nauseating horror. A dry, short crack, like the sound of a snapping horseshoe, and one of the leather, carefully crafted fastenings on Siniel's chest, unable to bear the monstrous, sudden strain, broke, scattering into tiny, useless fragments. Now he hung on the single remaining, tin, thread-like rope attached to his belt. Its other end was tightly, deftly wrapped around Ryniel's slender waist. The jolt was so powerful and unexpected that it threw the girl like a splinter against the opposite rough wall. Sharp, burning pain pierced her ribs, but ancient instinct and steel will proved stronger. Her fingers, slender and strong, dug into the thin cord woven of silver spider silk and sinew with such desperate force that her joints instantly whitened, drained of blood. Her feet braced against a tiny ledge, her whole body tensed, arching like a bowstring ready to snap. But the terrible weight of the falling body pulled her inexorably toward the edge, and the rope burned her exposed palms like red-hot wire. "Hold tighter!" Aylar's low voice thundered, and his powerful, rock-like figure lunged forward. But the distance was too great, and time flowed like molten, viscous lead, slowly and inexorably carrying away the last chances. Lyrael did not think. Her body, obedient to will and duty, outpaced thought itself. She did not run, she flung herself toward the edge of the chasm in a short, desperate leap, risking falling herself, and seized the thin, singing rope just above Ryniel's convulsively clenched fingers. The impact against the taut, string-like cord echoed in her arms and shoulders with fiery, tearing pain. It seemed the thin, almost invisible fibers were biting into the very flesh, reaching the cold bone, that their combined weight to fragile yet stubborn Ryniel and the light, cat-like tenacious Lyrael created that very point of leverage, stopping for a moment the deadly, unstoppable slide into black emptiness. Help! Altogether, Lyrael cried hoarsely, with a wrench torn from the very depths of her soul, and in her voice, usually so even and calm, sounded an uncharacteristic, wild plea. Pull! All the elves, until then frozen in stupor, seemed to awaken from sleep. Shaking off soul-chilling horror, they rushed to the very edge of the chasm, and their hands graceful, accustomed to a lyre's delicate strings and a bow's resilient tension, and strong, knowing the weight of a notched sword, all seized the thin, singing rope at once. Some grabbed the cord itself, biting into palms. Others seized Ryniel's torn cloak. Others Aelir's broad belt, who had managed to rush forward and stand ahead of them all. They pulled not in unison, not on command, but desperately, with a quiet, suppressed growl rising from the depths of their throats, understanding that every lost second, every weakening finger could be fatal. Fenrir, unable to push through the wall of bodies to the rope itself, collapsed onto the cold stone floor and, without thought for his own safety, leaned over the black, gaping abyss, trying to find some purchase for his knee with his foot, and with a long, sinewy arm to grab Ryniel's clothing or hand, dangling between life and death. More. Harder. Pull. Aelir snarled, and the mighty, cable-like muscles on his back and shoulders bulged and rippled under the thin, soaked fabric of his clothes. It seemed one more instant, one wrong move, and this thin thread of life would snap with a dry crack, or his own overworked heart would not withstand this monstrous strain and burst. And then, slowly and agonizingly, as if the abyss itself were reluctant to release its lawful prey, over the sharp, jagged edge of the cornice appeared first disheveled hair, then a pale face streaming with blood. His eyes were tightly shut, his fine, youthful features distorted by a grimace of mute pain and unconscious, animal terror. Fenrir, with a hoarse, victorious, torn cry, seized his sturdy tunic and, helping the others, wrenched the lifeless, limp body onto the hard, uneven stone of their tunnel. They collapsed all in a heap, rescuers and rescued, not distinguishing who was where. The rope slackened. The terrible tension binding each like an icy carapace vanished at once, leaving behind emptiness, a whistling in the ears, and a treacherous trembling in weakened knees. A silence fell, thick and heavy as pitch, smelling of acrid sweat, fresh blood, and exhaled fear. Lyrael slowly, with difficulty, unclenched her numb, almost alien fingers. Her palms were scored with deep, burning abrasions from which blood welled, dripping onto the gray, indifferent stone. She looked at her wounded hands with a strange, detached curiosity, as if seeing them for the first time in her long life. Ryniel, trembling as if in fever, sank to her knees beside the motionless Ryniel. Her own clothing on her chest was torn to shreds, and on her slender body were livid, ugly marks from the rope biting into her flesh. Halder, silently pushing her aside with a light but firm motion, was already bent over the youth, shielding him. His aged, wrinkled and scarred hands with unexpected tenderness and certainty felt his head, neck, arms, and legs. Alive, the old man rasped, and in that one short word sounded such deep, all-consuming relief that Iviel, standing aside and covering her mouth with her palm, felt rare, burning tears well in her eyes. Arm broken here, ribs, I think, whole, but deep bruises, to the bone, and his head hit hard. But has alive, damn it. Alive. Lyrael silently approached and looked at Ryniel's pale, sheet-white, lifeless face. In her ears still echoed that disgusting, dry, whip-crack sound of the breaking fastening. This was not just a mishap, not a mere accident on a long road. This was the mountain's stern, silent reminder that their elven skill and innate grace were nothing. Dust before the face of indifferent and all-powerful elements. Their gear, however masterfully crafted, was vulnerable and fragile. Their lives hung by a thread, on the strength of a tiny leather strap, on the might of a thread-thin, spider-silk cord. She raised her gaze and slowly, turning her head, looked over her companions. She saw their pale, frightened faces, their weary, deeply sorrowful eyes. But through this shared horror and mortal fatigue, something else broke through and emerged, a bitterness as sharp as wormwood, and a resolve as hard as steel. They had passed through the steel wind and saved one of their own. It had cost them their own pain, blood, and the last secret illusions that their path could be in any way safe. "Well, bandage him properly," Hulder said quietly, but with iron firmness, already taking from his travel bag narrow strips of soft, bleached leather and a small clay pot of thick healing soft smelling of honey and medicinal roots. "And move on, without delay. We cannot stay here by the edge for a moment." Lyrael silently, heavily nodded, her gaze, passing over Cineal's pale face, fixed on the depths of the tunnel, into the thickening, almost palpable gloom from where, it seemed, emanated that same barely perceptible drone. But this was not a sound one could hear with ears, rather, a vague, insistent vibration in the very bone, a call, an echo born not in the air, but in consciousness itself. It was like the reverberation of a long silent spell or a distant, alien moan heard not with ears, but with the whole soul. When the wind carries the memory of another's pain, this phantom drone did not call them to turn from their path. Their road, ordained and terrible, lay strictly east, over the passes and boundless steppes. The wind beyond the wall seemed not to abate at all but to gather new, furious force, shaking the stone walls of their unreliable refuge like an enraged beast. The air in the tunnel itself hummed low, like a taut string ready to snap at any moment, while from outside came a deafening, insane roar, as if the ancient dragon ridge itself had flown into a rage at their insolent, daring intrusion into its domain. A rockfall, begun somewhere high above their heads, showered beyond the narrow entrance with sharp, fine scree and suffocating dust, turning any stain near the exit into a sure death trap. Only one way remained: forward, deeper, into that very impenetrable darkness where, as she alone sensed, lurked and awaited them that same phantom, calling drone. Lyrael, still feeling the burning, throbbing pain in her lacerated palms, slowly rose to her feet and, instinctively leaning against the rough, cold surface of the wall, took a few unsteady steps away from the gaping edge of the chasm. Her shadow, distorted and sprawling in the uneven light of the sunstone, stretched grotesquely across the uneven rocky vault. She turned to the others, and her heart clenched at the sight. Her companions' faces in the ominous glow looked like the faces of long-dead people, waxy, pale, with deeply sunken, extinguished eyes. Even Aylar, always mighty and unbending as an oak, sat heavily leaning against stone, his mighty chest heaving. "We cannot stay here, on the edge." Lyrael's voice sounded hollow, but with that crystalline clarity that overrides even deafening storm roar. She did not look at them. Her gaze was fixed on the black, bottomless maw of the tunnel leading into the mountain's heart. "This wind, this madman, will hurl us all into the abyss along with these crumbling stones. Down there, into that darkness." Iviel exhaled in a strangled voice of horror, convulsively clutching her thin, trembling shoulders. "Though we don't know what awaits us there, only dead silence and soulless stone." "We know perfectly well what awaits us here," Fenner cut her off harshly, almost roughly. He was already on his feet, his cheekbones tense, the familiar fire burning in his eyes. "Here a clear and simple death, but in the tunnel there is at least some, even phantom, protection from this cursed, roaring wind." Old Hulder, having just finished bandaging Cineal's arm, silently nodded, and in his nod was the weight of many lived years and thousands of miles traveled. "The air inside is still, doesn't stir," he uttered, "meaning there is no draft, and a chance, however small, to wait out the worst. We must go, we have no other choice." Lyrael silently listened to them, but heard only echoes. They discerned only the deafening howl of the storm and the rumble of falling stones. They did not feel what she did, that low frequency, insistent drone vibrating not in the ears, but somewhere in the very depths of consciousness, like a call coming from the very black heart of the mountain. For them, this was simply a refuge, a stone sack. For her, a path to something that both attracted and nauseated with fear. She did not explain anything, did not waste strength on words. What difference did it make? In essence, what drove her forward? Sober calculation or this phantom, obsessive call? The end result was one and the same. They rose slowly, with incredible effort, as if every movement cost superhuman strength. Aylar and the massive Tarlan carefully but firmly took up the burden of the unconscious Cineal, fashioning a makeshift stretcher from cloaks and belts. Lyrael, taking a deep breath, approached the very boundary where the dim light ended and absolute darkness began. "We go," she said simply, unable to bear any longer this silent drone pressing on her temples, and took the first, decisive step into the dark, dissolving into it. They moved after her, one after another, like shadows, and as soon as the last of them crossed the invisible boundary, the furious wind outside seemed cut off by a thick door. A sepulchral, oppressive silence fell, broken only by the muffled rustle of their footsteps and ragged, hoarse breathing. For her companions, this was simply silence, an absence of sound. For Lyrael, the entire space around was saturated, permeated with that same silent drone, which now, separated from the storm, sounded in her consciousness even clearer, more insistent, more relentless, calling ever farther into the stone, cold bowels of the world. They descended along the narrow, throat-like tunnel, and with every new step, the rough stone walls closed tighter and more threateningly above their heads. Like a giant stone gullet slowly but surely swallowing its living prey, the air grew heavy, stale, and stagnant, smelling of ancient, dry dust, damp stone, and something else faint, barely perceptible, yet sinister. The scent of ozone and cooled molten metal, as if somewhere in the deepest bowels of this mountain, long before their arrival, a monstrous, all-consuming conflagration had raged. Lyrael walked ahead, her dimly glowing stone clutched in her bloodied hand, cast in leaping, grotesque, living shadows on the walls. She moved slowly, almost stealthily, freezing and stopping after every dozen steps, listening into the silence. Her sharp, incredibly keen ears, capable of hearing a snowflake fall, caught the slightest movement of dead air, the slightest foreign sound. But aside from her companions' ragged breathing, the creak of their soles on the stone floor, and the distant, omnipresent drone now sounding right inside her skull, there was absolutely nothing to hear. "How much longer must we walk in this dark?" Iviel asked quietly, almost in an inaudible whisper, and her voice, usually melodious and song-like, now seemed unnaturally loud and coarse in the oppressive, absolute silence. "This stone, it presses on the soul, won't let you breathe, until we find at least some place where we can stop and rest in relative safety." Halder answered just as quietly, moving his lips, his aged but keen eyes sliding tirelessly over the walls, peering into every crack, every suspicious outcrop. "Patience, my child. Remember, in the mountains a haste is certain death." Suddenly, from somewhere ahead, out of the very thick of the dark, came a short, dry, very distinct rustle as if a small, solitary pebble had rolled off an invisible ledge and tumbled down. The whole company froze as if rooted, turning to stone statues. Even breathing ceased, catching in throats. Lyrael sharply raised her hand, signaling an absolute halt, and covered the light of her stone with her palm, plunging them almost into total, blinding darkness. 10 pairs of elven eyes, capable of seeing in the dark far better than any human, stare, widening, into the impenetrable blackness ahead. Hearts beat loudly, anxiously, and rapidly, echoing in strained gears like a deafening, furious pounding. Fenrir slowly, soundlessly, with a motion practiced over ages, took his bow from his back, and his slender, strong fingers settled on the taut string. Aelor just as noiselessly, with a smooth gesture, drew his long, straight blade, and its edge glinted dully in the near-total dark. They stood like that, not moving, for what seemed an eternity, becoming part of the cliff, merging into the ancient, silent waiting of the mountain itself. That the rustle, the very one that had made them freeze, did not repeat. Only a quiet, soul-chilling, slow grinding came from somewhere above. From within the thickness of the rock, likely another layer of ancient strata shifting, a hair's breadth under monstrous pressure, finding new equilibrium. It was a natural, almost living sound of breathing, ever-shifting mountains, but here, in this subterranean, sepulchral silence, it seemed a sinister portent, the whisper of the very stone gullet about to snap shut. "Nothing. Nothing for now," Lyrael finally exhaled, and the general tension eased a little, allowing a new gulp of stale air. "We go on. But be ready for anything. Do not relax." They walked for a long time yet, descending ever lower along a gentle but inexorable, time-like slope leading them into the very gut of the world. They often stopped, freezing in place, listening until their ears ached, tearing until their eyes burned into the impenetrable dark ahead, and their nerves, already taut, were strained now to the limit, like strings before snapping. Every indistinct rustle, every deceptive, echoing whisper born from their own footsteps made hearts skip a beat for a moment, and slender, strong fingers convulsively clutched sword hilts and bows. They were children of the forest, born for sunlight and boundless expanse, and this stone, damp dungeon oppressed their immortal souls far more heavily than any physical burden on their backs. The silence, broken only by these sparse, frightening sounds and their own muffled steps, weighed on them, breeding in their chests a restlessness like an itch. To somehow relieve this oppressive tension, the young archer Lyrael, whose face in the ghostly stonelight seemed especially pale and frightened, broke the silence, addressing old Halder, whose memory seemed to hold in its folds the chronicles of all that is. Halder, he began quietly, almost shyly, and his voice, not yet roughened, sounded softly yet surprisingly clear in the ringing subterranean silence. These mountains, the Dragon Ridge, why do they bear such a name? Haven't all the great dragons long since departed from this world, leaving behind only a handful of dust and dusty legends? The old tracker, not taking his attentive, faded gaze from the dark ahead, coughed hoarsely, with a wheeze, clearing his throat. It seemed the very darkness ahead, thick and alive, listened to his every word. Departed, but not all, not all, he rasped, and his words, heavy and slow as ancient runes, settled into the resonant, sound-hungry silence. In the very first age, the age of dawn, when the world was young, green, and full of unbridled wrath, these very mountains were the cradle and last stronghold of the fiery monsters. They were not gods, no, do not deceive yourself. They were the very element, clad in scales and flame, born in the world's core. Great as hills, the worms slept in these very stone walls, and the black smoke of their breath rose in thick clouds over the very peaks, blotting out the sun for days and weeks. He paused, letting the young elf and the others, hushed and attentive, picture in all its fullness this colossal, terrifying image. They say the last of the great dragons, the one called Nightwing, was felled in these very caves by the dwarf king of Ganabar himself, great thumbered fiery heart. Halder continued, unhurriedly, and felled not with hammer or axe, but with ancient cunning, diverting a raging river of molten stone from the very depths straight into its lair. Millennia had passed since then. The dwarves who dwell below assure that not a single living nest remains, that they all either fell in battle, or fell into a sleep so deep and dreamless, it is indistinguishable from death itself. And could some have remained? Iviel asked timidly, as if afraid to startle the silence, involuntarily bringing a slender hand to her throat. All is possible, child, all is possible in this old world. The old elf shrugged his narrow, bony shoulders. Mountains keep their secrets far tighter than we elves keep our sorrows. But if any remain, they sleep now dead, stone sleep, and it is worth no one's while to wake them, not the dwarves in their blind, greedy pride, nor us, who have strayed here in our last desperation. Their time, the time of fire and scale, has passed, as, perhaps, our own now pauses. 'Tis words, bitter and heavy, hung in the stale air, mixing with ancient dust and impenetrable gloom. The mere thought that somewhere quite nearby, in these black, silent stone sacks, ancient, incomprehensible, and dread beings might sleep, whose power surpassed any mortal weapon and any, even the strongest, magic, made them feel even more fragile, insignificant, and temporary. They were but a handful of weary elves wandering through mountains that remembered still the birth and death of whole civilizations. Lyrael, who had listened to all this in silence, threw a short, sharp glance into the waiting dark. Her goal was painfully clear and pragmatic: to lead the exhausted company out to the eastern slopes, into the dry steppes. But now, after old Halder's words, every new turn of the tunnel, every hidden dark grotto concealed not just the physical danger of collapse or chasm, but the mute echo of an ancient, colossal horror sleeping a dreamless sleep in the very heart of the stone mass. The tunnel began slowly to widen, its rough walls parting, receding into impenetrable, velvet dark on both sides, creating a strange, oppressive sense of space in total darkness. The stone floor under their feet grew ever smoother and more level, as if once, in immemorial times, it had been worked by skilled hands and tools, leaving no visible trace of time or erosion. The air, however, remained just as stale and thick. Only the musty smell of dust and damp stone gradually gave way to a more complex, anxious bouquet, the faint but discernible scent of cooled ashes, moist, heavy clay, and something else, sharp, animal, and unpleasant, that tickled the nostrils and made them wince. Lyrael walked ahead, peering tensely into the pressing dark from all sides, her glowing stone clutched in her bloodied palm, snatching from the all-consuming blackness only wretched, small islands of space that immediately drowned in black emptiness. And it was in this expanding, bottomless dark, in its very heart, that a vague, obsessive, creeping feeling began slowly to form and strengthen, a feeling not subject to reason, a feeling that they were being watched, intently, relentlessly. At first it was just a vague, barely perceptible whisper of ancient instinct, a voice of blood troubling the soul, but soon this sensation solidified, became almost tangible, physically pressing. The elves' backs involuntarily tensed, the skin on their napes ached, and prickled from thousands of invisible needles, as if from an intent, unfriendly gaze boring into them from the dark. Iviel, walking in the very middle of the stretched-out chain, could not bear this oppressive pressure and sharply, almost panickedly, turned round, driving a fevered gaze into the black, silent emptiness behind. Her eyes, wide with fear, saw absolutely nothing but thick, impenetrable gloom. "Did you hear?" she whispered, addressing Aelor, who walked behind her, carrying with Tarlin the heavy stretcher bearing the unconscious Cineal. The mighty elf only silently, with a tense face, shook his head, but his own gaze, heavy and wary, also darted into the dark abyss behind his back. He heard nothing but the muffled steps of his kin and their restrained breathing, but he felt the same as all the others, an invisible, hostile presence. Fenner, walking as rearguard, and thus feeling the danger most acutely, moved walking backward, his sturdy bow half-drawn, the arrowhead cutting the dead air with a dull, threatening whistle with each cautious step. He saw nothing ahead, but his back, turned to the company receding into the dark, was strained to the limit, as if he expected a treacherous blow from behind at any second. The silence around became different, not empty and lifeless, but thick, charged with invisible threat, like a powder keg before an explosion. Every accidental scrape of a pebble under someone's incautious foot, every restrained, short sigh echoed in this ringing silence with a loud, treacherous echo. They walked now, instinctively pressing their backs against each other, forming a living, breathing, yet fragile shield of their own bodies. Even the wounded Cineal, lying in painful half-slumber, seemed to sense this general, binding tension. His breathing grew more ragged and hoarse, and the fingers of his good hand stirred restlessly, convulsively. Lyrael stopped sharply again, raising high the hand clutching her stone. She covered it with her palm, dimming the shimmering light almost to extinction, and in the next instant they were engulfed in absolute, pitch, blinding dark. All froze in place, not breathing, turned to stone statues. And in this oppressive, absolute blackness, when hearing sharpened to its limit, they finally heard it. Not the drone that pursued Lyrael, not a whisper, a quiet, barely perceptible, yet distinct rustle, not from ahead or behind, from above. It came from somewhere on the very ceiling of this invisible subterranean hall, quick, dry, and scraping, as if large scales had momentarily slid over rough stone. Once, briefly, and again dead, sepulchral silence fell, even more sinister after that sound. 10 pairs of elven eyes, capable of discerning the slightest movements in darkness, shot upward as one into the impenetrable velvet gloom hanging like a heavy pall over their heads. They stood, pressed into the cold stone floor, their hearts pounding somewhere in their very throats, and in their fingers, convulsively clutching weapon hilts. There was not a drop of former warmth. They saw absolutely nothing in that black height, but they knew with chilling certainty that there, in the very thick of the dark, something was. And it breathed, moved, and watched them. The tension did not ease in all the following hours. It hung in the stale air like a heavy blanket. The sensation of invisible, hostile presence hovered around them like the scent of an approaching thunderstorm before the downpour. They walked, feeling on their backs the constant, pressing heaviness of alien, unfriendly attention, hearing phantom rustles and creaks born of their own fear and the cavernous, deceptive acoustics of the underground. Every new turn of the tunnel, every new cave they entered with bated breath met them with the same oppressive, wary silence, as if the mountain itself, a living being, held its breath, watching the uninvited guests in its sacred dowels. After many hours of exhausting, soul-draining travel, when legs already refused to obey and buckled, and eyelids grew heavy with leaden weariness, the narrow tunnel unexpectedly, without any warning, led them into a vast, high cave whose boundaries were invisible in the dark. The air here was different, moist, fresh, cool, with a distinct, long-awaited taste of clean water. And soon, taking a few more steps forward, they saw it. In the very center of the vast cave, under low-hanging stalactites like frozen giants' tears, lay a small lake. Its waters were black, thick, and absolutely motionless, like obsidian melted by night, and only the weak, shimmering reflection of their glowing stones snatched from the dark a small patch of smooth, polished mirror surface. From the very ceiling, from sharp, needle-like growths, fell rare, heavy drops with a quiet, measured, heartbeat-like cadence, and each such impact gave birth on the black water's surface to small, spreading circles that ran to invisible edges and vanished without trace, as if never there. Water, someone whispered with such deep, choking relief as if they had found the last source of life in the most merciless desert. Lyrael, still weary and cold like a spring, slowly and thoroughly surveyed the cave with her keen, experienced gaze. The niche for a camp was almost ideal. On one side the black lake, on the other the single, narrow entrance, easy to control and defend. But this very convenience also made them vulnerable, like fish in a glass bowl displayed for all to see. "We stop here," she threw out shortly and authoritatively. But no one relaxes. Ailer, Fenner, take position at the entrance, keep your eyes peeled. Guard shifts every 2 hours, no delays. They made camp with that quiet, meticulously efficient precision born only on the brink of life and death. Cloaks were neatly spread on the driest patches of stone floor, away from the mysterious water. Orlin and the massive Tarlin, once again a living, unbreakable shield, settled right at the cave entrance, and their weary but keen gazes tirelessly bored into the waiting dark of the tunnel from which they had come. Iviel and Riniel immediately, without wasting a moment, attended to the wounded Seniel, carefully, almost with maternal tenderness, removing the old, blood-soaked bandages. They saw that the wounds under the layer of healing salve, smelling of honey and medicinal roots, looked far better than one could have hoped. Inflammation had almost subsided, redness gone, and even the deep, lacerated abrasions on Lyrael's own palms had begun to heal with a thin, pink film of new, young skin. "How do you feel now?" Iviel asked softly, kindly, applying a fresh, fragrant portion of salve to his fracture. Seniel, who had lain in painful half-slumber all the exhausting journey, slowly, with effort, opened his eyes. In them was no trace of the former animal terror, only deep, all-consuming weariness and burning shame for his weakness. "Better." His voice was hoarse from immobility, but in it sounded a firm, steely thread. "Arm still hurts, every muscle, but not like before, not to darkness in the eyes. I think I can walk on my own, if need be." He tried to rise on his good elbow, and old Halder, sitting nearby and watching him like a hawk, did not hinder him, only watched every movement attentively. The young elf clenched his teeth to whiteness from the pain that shot through him, but managed, overcoming himself, to sit up. It was a small, almost unnoticeable, yet incredibly important feat for all. In his eyes, once extinguished, a weak flame kindled, not hope yet, but at least a grim resolve not to be a burden to his kin any longer. Lyrael, watching this scene from the side, felt a heavy stone shift slightly from her soul, allowing a slightly deeper breath. One problem, one weakness in their small company had grown less, but she still, with the skin of her back, sensed that very wary, heavy, merciless gaze, as if something large and ancient from the impenetrable dark on the other side of the lake intently watched their small, wretched refuge, coldly assessing and biding its time. And the silence around, despite the falling drops, remained unnatural, too deep and faint, as if someone invisible deliberately muffled all other sounds of this underground world, the better to hear their every sigh, every whisper. Lyrael stood at the very edge of the black, fathomless water, but did not see her reflection. Her gaze, fixed on the motionless, mirror-like surface, was blind and empty. Turned inward, where colliding and intertwining thoughts swirled in a tangled mass, heavy as the very mountain rock around. She mentally sifted through fragments of conversation, fragments of memory about the crack in the white tree, the phantom bow beyond the thin barrier of worlds. Where are we truly going? And what will we find at the end of this path? This obsessive question echoed in her with a hollow, hopeless echo. She was so deep, so completely withdrawn into herself that she almost physically no longer felt the moist, cool air of the cave, did not hear the measured falling of drops, and so she completely failed to notice, to catch, the moment when the perfectly mirror-like, dark surface of the lake right before her suddenly, without a single sound, was disturbed. At first it was just a ripple, a single, barely noticeable spreading circle somewhere in the very center of the black mirror, as if from the fall of a tiny, weightless grain of sand. It slowly reached the invisible in darkness shore and faded without trace. The former silence reigned, broken only by the measured cadence of falling drops. Then, after a few breaths, another circle appeared, and another, and another. They arose now not in the center, but much closer to that opposite shore, drowned in impenetrable gloom, as if someone invisible, standing knee-deep in black water, methodically and quietly tossed small, polished pebbles into it. The circles grew wider, more frequent, overlapping each other. They were no longer chaotic now. It seemed as if some invisible, phantom hand trailed fingertips over the water, drawing complex, fleeting, and meaningless patterns on its black, glossy surface. From them ran a light, barely audible tremor over the water, and the dim light of their glowing stones, reflecting in it, shattered into thousands of tiny, restless, as if living, glimmers dancing across the cave vaults. Lyrael still noticed nothing, seeing and hearing nothing. She was entirely captive to her gloomy thoughts, drowning in them headlong. Only when the reflection of one such jumping glimmer, alive and elusive, slid over the rough cave wall to her left, snatching from the dark for an instant the petrified, tense faces of her companions, did she shudder all over, as if struck, and awoke, returning to reality. Her own breathing caught, stuck in her throat. Slowly, with a heart freezing from a bad premonition, she lowered her gaze to the water at her feet, and froze, as if turned to a pillar of salt. The entire surface of the black, lifeless water was now crisscrossed with a dense network of spreading, overlapping circles. They seemed born of the very void, without any visible cause, and ran to the shores, breaking in a strange, almost musical, yet no less sinister rhythm. It was inexplicable and unnatural, as if the lake itself had suddenly begun to breathe, or something large and invisible beneath its smooth surface stirred, awoke. She turned sharply to cry out, to warn the others, but words, sharp and cold, stuck in her throat, unable to break free. All the elves who were not asleep at that moment were already watching, mesmerized and frightened. The water, Iviel froze with a flask brought to her mouth, her beautiful eyes wide and full of superstitious, ancient terror. Even old Halder slowly rose to his feet, and his sinewy, scarred hand unhurriedly dropped to the familiar hilt of his hunting knife. Aylar and Fenner, standing guard at the very entrance, turned around, forgetting for a moment the dark approaching from the tunnel. Their gazes were riveted to this mysterious, eerie performance unfolding on the black water. Absolute, oppressive silence reigned in the cave, broken only by the measured, relentless cadence of falling drops from the heights. And in this sepulchral silence, the spectacle of circles born from nowhere on water black as eternal night seemed the most eerie and inexplicable omen. The whisper of fate itself. No sooner had she turned than Halder's hoarse, torn voice reached her, sounding with unusual, piercing sharpness that cut into the silence. Lyrael, away from the water, now. And in that same moment, before she could comprehend this desperate order, an icy, burning cold grip closed around her ankles, biting into flesh. Long, slippery, sticky, and incredibly strong tentacles, black as the very deep darkness and almost invisible against it, erupted from the seemingly motionless surface and seized her with such monstrous force that bones creaked under pressure. Sharp, tearing pain shot through her legs, and her body was jerked backward with inhuman power toward the waiting black water. "Got you," Aylar growled, appearing beside her in a mighty leap. His powerful, cable-like arm seized her under the armpits with an iron grip, and he braced his feet against the slippery, uneven stone, trying with all his weight to counter that monstrous, inexorable force pulling her into the dark lake depths. The water, until that moment seeming dead and still, suddenly seethed and churned with dark splashes. From the dark, fathomless depths rose, writhing, new, even thicker tentacles, slimy and like giant black water snakes. One of them, with a disgusting, squelching sound, wrapped around Aylar's muscular arm, forcing him to clench his teeth from sudden pain and deep, physiological revulsion. "Hold tight," Fenner cried piercingly, his long blade whizzing through the air and with one precise strike severing the tip of the tentacle right at Aylar's arm. Dark, viscous, almost black fluid splattered on the stones, spreading a nauseating smell of rotten stagnant water and acrid ozone. "Cut them! Faster!" he commanded, and his voice, full of furious resolve, cut into the deafening, rising squelching roar now rising from the very water's thickness. In the next instant, the once quiet cave turned into utter hell and chaos. Tarlin, the mighty guard, with a short roar brought his heavy, sturdy spear down on the thick, arm-like tentacle dragging Lyrael, but the weapon only struck the tough, steel-like hide with a dull, dry thud, failing to pierce it. Orlin, supple and quick as a snake, worked his lighter, more agile spear like a needle, trying to pierce the writhing tentacles at their most vulnerable, thin points where they emerged from the black, churning water. Iviel, casting aside her innate fear, feverishly drew a short, honed blade from her belt and began fiercely hacking at thin, black tendril-like appendages already trying to entangle Aelir's and Fenrir's legs. Her movements were jerky, full of deepest revulsion for the slippery flesh, yet incredibly precise, as if she were pruning dry branches in a garden. Ryniel raised her bow and, without aiming, fired a heavy arrow point-blank into the very base of the thick tentacle holding Lyrael. The sharp tip sank into the slippery, elastic flesh with a dull, squelching sound, and the creature jerked, emitting something like an underwater gurgling groan, but did not release its prey, only bit deeper. Lyrael, still squeezed in the icy vice of monstrous grip, writhed with her last strength in the bonds of slippery tentacles. Pain in ankles crushed to cracking was blinding and unbearable, but rage and will to life burned in her heart brighter than any agony. She twisted, trying to reach her own long blade, but her arms were bound in Aelir's steel embrace, who with all his heroic strength pulled her toward him, his mighty muscles bulging and hardening like stone boulders from inhuman strain. "I won't let go for anything," he hissed through clenched teeth, and his face turned crimson, large sweat drops standing out on his temples from incredible effort. It seemed they now held on by a single, thin, fragile thread by their shared, boiling fury and animal desperation. But with every blow struck, with every tentacle severed, new ones emerged from the black, churning water, as if this underwater nightmare had no end. And then a thought, sharp and clear as a lightning flash in utter darkness, pierced Lyrael's consciousness. Tentacles, dispressing dark, dishostile, tangible void around all these manifestations were the offspring of absolute, living gloom, and what had always been the truest and most ancient weapon against the very dark. "Light!" she cried out, and her voice broke from wild strain. "Bright light! This creature is a child of darkness." Her gaze darted to her glowing stone lying forgotten nearby in the turmoil. Its dim glimmer was catastrophically insufficient now. Something greater was needed. Not just illumination, but a blinding, all-consuming flash capable of tearing the very fabric of this ancient dark to shreds. Iviel, hearing her desperate cry, immediately, without thinking, flung aside her black slime-covered blade and, leaping back from another writhing tentacle, fell to her knees at her travel bag. Her slender, graceful hands trembled as she feverishly pulled out a small, carefully packaged and sewn leather pouch. In it, wrapped in soft cloth, lay several large, rough-to-the-touch gemstones like unpolished diamonds, ancient, blessed stones of starlight that elven masters had forged in Lendorn's deepest secret places in bygone peaceful ages. They were kept as the greatest treasure, for the darkest hours, when all other light sources were powerless. "All of you, turn away and close your eyes," Iviel cried desperately, clutching one of the cold stones in her hot, trembling palm. Fenrir, continuing to parry with his blade, sharply turned away, pressing his face to the cold wall. Tarlin and Orlin momentarily covered their faces with their cloaks. Aelir, not releasing Lyrael, pressed her head to his shoulder, himself squeezing his eyes shut. Iviel, gathering all her will, hurled the stone with all her might into the very center of the black, churning lake. No silence followed. There was a single sound, a quiet, high, singing crystal chime, as if a huge glass sphere had burst. And after it, a moment later, crashed an all-crushing, absolute wave of pure, white, unbearably bright light. It did not burn, it was born in an instant, filling the cave to its farthest, secret corners, scorching all shadows to ash, leaving them no place to exist. For one blinding moment, it became brighter underground than on the clearest, most cloudless summer day, and immediately came a sound, not a cry or a roar, but a deafening, piercing, multi-toned shriek, emanating as if from the very thickness of the water and the air round. It was the sound not of physical pain, but of the very essence of darkness, wounded and scorched in its very foundation. The tentacles entwining Lyrael and Aelir instantly slackened, as if turned to rags, then jerked in a convulsive spasm and began rapidly, with a hissing, to retreat into the water, as if they had touched red-hot iron. The monster did not vanish, did not turn to dust from the sacred light. It merely retreated, to reveal its true, incomprehensible horror. The light died as suddenly as it was born, leaving dancing crimson spots in their eyes, blinding them momentarily. And in this newly descended, even thicker and more hostile dark, the water in the very center of the lake swelled in a huge black, pulsating bubble, as if something unimaginable were rising from the very depths. From the abyss slowly, with a heavy, gurgling, death rattle-like rumble, rose that which froze the blood in their veins. It was a head, colossal, devoid of any form known to living beings, covered not in scales, but in something like old, black, slippery, eternally cracked skin, studded with pale, phosphorescent in the dark spots like flesh rotting in the sun. In place of eyes gaped 3 empty, bottomless, oozing black, viscous slime sockets, and the maw occupied a good half of this monstrous head. It slowly, with a nasty, squelching sound, opened, revealing countless, chaotically growing rows of curved, needle-sharp fangs like dagger shards. From this dark abyss erupted not sound, but a physical wave of soul-chilling pressure that made the cave walls tremble. Fine stone rubble rained down, and ring in their ears as if struck. The monster had not dissolved. It revealed itself in all its primordial, terrifying might, and now looked at them with the blind but full of ancient and indifferent hatred, emptiness of its eye sockets. No sooner had the icy, burning grip of the tentacles slackened than Lyrael, gathering her will into a fist, tore free of Aelur's steel embrace and sprang to her feet, nearly falling from the piercing pain in her numbed, mangled legs. A deep, livid bruise already blossomed on her pale skin, but there was no time for that now. No time for her own flesh. 2 arms, her voice, hoarse from strain but commanding and sharp as a steel strike, cut through the rising, oppressive roar of the monster. Bows to hand, arrows to string, as if by an invisible, years practice signal. 9 elves, not counting the wounded Sineal, whom old Halder quickly and deftly dragged deep into the cave to the very wall, closed ranks into a single hole. Shoulder to shoulder, into tears, they formed a living, breathing wall of bodies and resolve. The polished wooden backs of boughs rattle and creak, taken down with one swift, practiced motion. 9 arrows, fletched with mountain eagle feathers, were laid on drawn bowstrings, and their sharp tips of moon-tempered elven iron were aimed at a single point, at the monster. Even Tarlin and Orlin, whose spears were thrust into the ground at their feet for quick access, drew the strings of their large, resilient, deadly bows. The maw and eye sockets, aim for the vulnerable. Lyrael cried, herself aiming into the gaping, gurgling blackness of the monstrous throat. Fire. The air in the cave shuddered and rang from the single, deafening slap of 9 taut bowstrings. 9 arrows, like a flock of enraged, bloodthirsty hawks, streaked toward the colossal, loathsome head. They thudded into the slippery black skin, bounced off it like from stone with a dry, fruitless clatter. But some found their mark sank into more sensitive tissue at the very edge of the maw, drove deep into the empty, oozing caustic slime eye sockets. The monster roared. This time the sound was more tangible, carnal, full of blind and unrestrained fury. It slowed its smooth advance forward. Its head jerked back from the hail of precise strikes. From wounds left by arrows oozed not blood but thick, black, oily, viscous slime, slowly spreading over its slippery skin and dripping into the water with a quiet, hissing sound, like red-hot iron. Do not slacken the assault, Fenrir commanded, already snatching a new, deadly arrow from his quiver and knocking it. They shot, again and again, not letting the creature recover. The air quickly filled with the acrid, nauseating smell of this slime, mingled with ozone and rotten, stagnant water. Arrow after arrow sank into the monster, making it shudder and emit new, furious, deafening roars, but seemed unable to inflict a mortal, decisive wound. They could not kill it, could not turn it to flight, but they made it clear. These small, fragile beings would not be easy, unresisting prey, and they continued to shoot, retreating slowly and in an organized manner, step by step, toward the very cave exit, and their pale, gaunt faces were lit not by hope's light but by the cold, steely fire of rage and desperate, to the bone resolve. The monster, thoroughly enraged by this hail of piercing arrows, emitted a new, deafening, multi-tone roar that again made the cave walls tremble and fine stones rain from the ceiling. It ceased being merely a target passively receiving blows. Its colossal head, bristling with protruding arrows like a porcupine, lunged forward, and from the black, churning water with a heavy, gurgling, boiling tar-like sound began slowly to rise its body, its true form. It was like the body of a colossal, prehistoric serpent, only as if forged from the densest night and abyssal depths of a forgotten ocean. Long, serpentine, devoid of clear contours, covered with the same slippery, cracked skin. It writhed, rising from the lake, revealing truly monstrous, mind-crushing dimensions. Water with a loud splash retreated from its bulk, exposing a thickness surpassing several logs stacked together. And again, from the shadow under the head and along its entire gigantic body, now erupted dozens of tentacles long, black, relentless, and blind. They slapped onto the stones with a wet sound, feeling the shore with their tips, trying to outflank the elves, cut them off from the soul-saving exit, lock them forever in this stone trap. Tentacles, from both sides, flanking. Orlin cried sharply, raising his light, polished spear and stepping back a pace to cover their exposed right flank. Tarlin, not releasing his large bow, with a foot movement, quick and precise, lifted his own heavy spear from the ground, and with a short effort hurled it at the nearest tentacle, crawling along the ground like a blind snake. The sharp, razor-like tip sank into the elastic flesh with a dull, squelching thud, pinning it to the stone for one precious instant, but from the black, restless water immediately crawled, writhing, a new one, ready to take its place. Lyrael clearly understood their shooting at the massive head was almost useless. As if they were throwing peas at a stone wall, they needed to strike at the most vulnerable, at what moved this monstrous bulk, served as its support and life. Aim for the neck, where the head joins the body, she ordered, changing her own target. Her next arrow, fired with cold fury, sank into that very place where, like a neck, the giant body grew, and the monster jerked again, this time clearly and convulsively, from real, piercing pain. But it was already too close. Its monstrous, gaping maw full of needle-sharp fangs was already within a couple of dozen steps of their close-knit formation, and the living, black tentacles inexorably tightened in the ring, cutting off retreat paths. They continued slowly retreating, firing back, but every step back was a step into a trap the narrow, throat-like cave exit could at any moment turn into their common grave, if the monster managed to finally block it with its body. One of the tentacles, more sinuous and agile than the others, darted not toward the elves covering the formation, but into its very depth, to where against the very wall sat the wounded Senil, pale as linen and weak, leaning on his good elbow, coaling, slippery as eel's loops instantly wrapped around his waist and injured, bandaged arm, and before anyone could react, yanked him with force from the cold stone, away from the saving cliff, away from the others, into the air. No, Riniel cried out, but her thin, desperate cry drowned in a new, triumphant, deafening roar of the monster scenting easy prey. Senil, helpless as a chick torn from the nest, was carried through the air, swinging, straight toward the gaping, dark maw that opened even wider, anticipating imminent and easy prey. He did not scream, did not call for help, only his wide, terror, and pain-filled eyes met Lyrael's gaze for an instant, and in them she read not a plea for salvation, but a quiet, resigned, and clear farewell. All the fury, all the accumulated despair, all the bitterness of the long journey compressed in her heart into one cold, razor-honed spike of pure, unadulterated hatred. But her mind, cold and clear, knew her own arrow, even the fastest, would no longer make it in time. Aelor did. The mighty elf, until then standing in formation like an impregnable crag, suddenly lunged forward, breaking the line. It was not a graceful, years-trained leap, it was a short, furious, almost animalistic lunge of his whole body, investing in this rush all his might and will. He did not dodge the writhing tentacles, he plowed through them like a living battering ram, sweeping all aside. A thick, arm-like tentacle blocking his path lashed, trying to ensnare and strangle. Aelor did not waste time hacking at it, moments were precious. Instead, he simply presented a bent, muscular arm, taking the full blow upon himself, and roughly, with an unpleasant crunch, flung it aside, not slowing. A second tentacle, like a whip, scored his thigh, leaving a deep, bloody stride, but pain only made him clench his teeth and make the last, decisive effort. He did not fly through the air, did not soar, he ran on the ground, and his last, desperate step, launching him from the stones into the final lunge, resembled more a controlled fall, stopped only by his unbending will. His long, straight blade, that very last argument of despair, described a short, deadly arc. In this movement was nothing of elven grace, nothing beautiful, only the naked, animal necessity and all the clarity of purpose that comes only in the last, decisive moment of life. The blade did not merely strike, did not glance, it pierced through, sharp as a needle. Elven iron, guided by fury and unquenchable strength, entered that very vulnerable spot at the base of the head and passed through, through flesh, through cartilage, through the very essence of this spawn of darkness, tearing it from within. For an instant, a silence reigned in the cave as deafening and unnatural as the preceding roar. The triumphant, victorious shriek of the monster suddenly turned into a hoarse, choked, gurgling rattle. Its maw, already almost closed on its prey, froze half open, then slowly gaped even wider, as if in mute astonishment. The tentacles holding Cineal in their grip instantly slackened, unclenched, and the young elf crashed onto the sharp stones with a dull, heavy thud, rolling by inertia away from the monster. The colossal head itself, with its still frozen mask of mute, bewildered fury, tore from the torso and with a heavy, wet, disgusting plop rolled into the black water and slowly, like a stone, sank, leaving on the surface only a slowly spreading trail of thick, black, oily slime. The enormous, serpentine body, bereft of its ugly head, convulsed, twisted in final agony, striking the black water with such blind force that high, dirty splashes reached even the elves, leaving dark, oily stains on their cloaks. It thrashed in death throes, helplessly slapping the water with its numerous tentacles, now moving without any purpose or sense, like severed snakes, then slowly, inexorably, like a sinking ship, began to submerge into the depths, dragging down into eternal dark all remnants of its monstrous, incomprehensible being. A sepulchral, unnatural silence reigned in the cave, broken only by the elves' heavy, ragged breathing and Ryniel's quiet, stifled sobs as she, trembling all over as in fever, clutched the rescued Cineal to herself, as if afraid he would be taken again. They stood, stunned and devastated, unable to tear their gaze from the black, common lake surface, as if expecting a new, even more terrible fiend to rise from its depths. First to shake off this stupor was Lyrael. Pain in her lacerated, rope-scored palms and numbed, bruised legs was burning and relentless, that the cold duty of responsibility lying on her shoulders proved stronger than any physical pain. Halder, Iviel, her voice sounded hoarse, torn, but with that steely firmness that brooked no argument. Tend to the wounds, everyone, every last one. They moved slowly, as if sleepwalkers forcibly torn from the most terrible nightmare, their limbs heavy and disobedient. Iviel, with a pale, gaunt face, with silent resignation took out her clay pot of salve again. The scent of honey and medicinal roots, once seeming so cozy and homely, now smelled only of bitter, necessary medicine and cruelly reminded how much pain and suffering they all yet had to endure. Aelor, clenching his teeth to cracking, silently allowed the deep, ragged wound on his thigh, from which scarlet blood mixed with the creature's black slime oozed, to be bandaged. Cineal, still trembling from experienced horror and pain, received a new, generous portion of salve for his broken arm. Lyrael silently, without a single groan, extended her bloody, lacerated palms to Iviel, who, compressing her lips in helplessness, set to her difficult work, washing away the sticky black slime with warm water from her flask, and carefully applying thick salve to the inflamed, burning skin. She worked silently, concentratedly, but when her fingers touched damaged skin, from them emanated an even, deep warmth, like sunlight. This was not the dazzling radiance of magic, it was a patient, life-giving emanation of life itself, which she skillfully and concentratedly directed, and as soon as the last bandages were secured and the bloody rag stowed away, Lyrael, overcoming piercing pain in every muscle, rose to her feet. Every movement, every breath echoed in her exhausted body with a sharp stab. That her will was immeasurably stronger than any flesh. No one uttered a word. Any word seemed unnecessary, empty, even dangerous now, capable of breaking this fragile, hard-won lull, returning them to the maelstrom of the just-departed nightmare. They simply looked at each other with weary, extinguished eyes, and in their gazes, in the many meeting looks, was read one and the same, simple and terrible. We are still alive, but we have no right to stay here a moment longer. We go, she announced shortly and unconditionally, and in her torn voice was not a drop of doubt or room for objection. Now, without delay, they, silently and quickly, gathered their scant gear scattered in the turmoil, carefully retrieved those arrows still usable, washing off the black slime. Their gazes, sharp and restless, darted ceaselessly about the cave, searching for the slightest movement in the trembling shadows, boring into the impenetrable dark beyond their wretched, phantom circle of light. Every accidental rustle, every distant, measured sound of a falling draught made hearts skip a beat for a moment and fingers involuntarily by old memory-clenched sword hilts and bass. They moved on along the narrow tunnel, leaving behind the black, bottomless lake and that inexpressible evil that lurked in its depths. But fear, real and physically palpable, did not release them, did not remain behind. It followed at their heels like a shadow, clung to the wet hems of their cloaks, whispered in their ears with icy breath of new, unknown dangers lurking ahead. They walked, instinctively pressing their backs to the rough, cold walls, freezing at every step, tearing until their eyes burned into every dark crack, every suspicious turn ahead. Their path, ordained by stars and despair, lay far to the east, toward light and free-stepped expanses. But here, in the stone, merciless belly of the Dragon Ridge, every next step forward was a step blind, into unknown, full of ancient, mute horrors and silent, relentless threats. And they knew for certain, that to the desired exit they yet had many such steps to take, and each of them, from first to last, could easily and simply be the last. Several long days and endless nights merged for them into a single, draining to the bone semi-dark existence devoid of time and peace. They walked, driven only by raw instinct of self-preservation, slept in snatches, a few short hours, relieving each other on watch always too, with drawn bowstrings and gazes boring into the oppressive, dense dark, ready at any moment to meet death. Their dreams were troubled, fragmented, and brief, and each awakening each time a bitter return to the same endless nightmare of stone walls, sepulchral silence, and eternal, exhausting expectation of a sudden blow from behind. Wounds slowly healed under Eviel's skill and miraculous salves, but overall fatigue accumulated, settling as a leaden, unbearable heaviness in the very bones and making their gazes extinguish and empty. And then, when it already seemed this endless stone labyrinth could have no end, the tunnel along which they wormed their way unexpectedly led them into a vast, imagination-striking subterranean space, whose grandeur took the breath away even from the most seasoned and much-traveled trackers. They stood on the very edge of a colossal underground hall, so enormous that the dim light of their stones reached neither the high vaulted ceiling, lost somewhere in velvet, absolute blackness, nor the opposite wall hidden in impenetrable gloom. The air here was drier than in the tunnels, smelling of cooled metal, soot, and ancient, untouched by any foot dust. But what struck and frightened was not this. In the midst of this majestic underground realm, diverging in all directions like arteries of a colossal stone heart, were tunnels, dozens of them, perhaps even hundreds, some wide, with neatly hewn walls and traces of ancient, masterful masonry, obviously once main trade and military routes, others narrow, low, gaping black, bottomless pits like burrows. Some were completely blocked by long ago. Mighty collapses from others wafted a faint but palpable draft, carrying a vague promise of different, unknown near and, perhaps, an exit. This was a grand junction, created not by blind nature but by intelligent hands, a mighty, stubborn, and long-departed race. That very dwarf junction, the great crossroads where once all paths of their endless underground kingdom converge and diverge, now silent, dead, and thus even more eerie. Lyrael slowly, as if in a trance, approached the very edge of the stone platform and froze, tearing into this gigantic, frightening stone lace of passages receding into dark. Her companions silently, like ghosts, stood behind, shoulder to shoulder, and on their weary, pale faces was read the same thought, turning into quiet, hopeless despair. Where to now? Which way? All these countless tunnels looked equally alien, equally dark, silent, and equally promising only unknown and new dangers. The choice of path they made now, this very minute, could lead them to the desired, saving exit on the eastern slopes, or into a dead, hopeless cul-de-sac, a death trap, or straight into the embrace of some new, unknown underground horror. Not a single map, not a single old song told us of such, Eviel whispered quietly, with reverent and soul-chilling horror, and her voice was so tiny and lost in this grand, overwhelming space, it was barely audible. Is this is Ganabar itself? Seniel asked in a strangled voice, peering into the blinding scale of these halls, their mute, oppressive grandeur. Old Halder, not taking his gaze from the revealed panorama, slowly, almost tenderly, ran his aged, scarred hand over the rough, cold surface of the wall, as if reading it like a book. Only the antechamber, the outskirts, he rasped, and in his voice sounded not just certainty, but knowledge drawn from the depth of ages. We stand at the very threshold of their ancient, forgotten holdings. All these paths once led to rich mines, minor fortress outposts, and remote outposts. Ganabar itself, their impregnable citadel, must lie deeper still, in the darkest, most protected heart of the western ridge. This was not the legendary fortress of Ganabar itself, not the heart of bygone dwarven might with its endless halls, countless treasuries, and fiery forges. No, they had reached only the farthest outskirts, an ancient, abandoned transport node from where once, in the Age of Dawn, began all paths to or veins, abandoned outposts, and, perhaps, to the surface. The very scale of construction was grandiose and overwhelming, but in it was felt not the capital, imperial power, but the stern, practical utility of the farthest frontier. Lyrael slowly approached the very edge of the stone ledge and froze, peering into this gigantic, frightening stone lace of passages receding into impenetrable dark. Her companions silently, with bated breath, stood behind, feeling the oppressive might of this underground metropolis. All tunnels without exception looked equally alien, silent, and equally promising only unknown and new mortal dangers. She stood motionless, absorbing with all her soul the oppressive scale of this place, understanding that somewhere here, in this labyrinth, was lost their only trail to salvation. They had reached the outskirts of the great dwarven maze, and now they had to find the true road out of it, knowing neither maps nor guide signs. The silence of the colossal hall, broken only by their own ragged breathing and cautious rustle of steps on dusty stone, was suddenly roughly torn. The voice did not sound loudly, not as a shout, but with such metallic, relentless clarity that each word imprinted itself on consciousness, like the blow of a minting hammer on red-hot steel. Elves, halt, and do not move a single muscle. The phrase hung in the stale air, cold, impersonal, and brooking no argument. And before they could grasp where this voice came from the dark mouths of dozens of tunnels, from behind massive stone outcrops and columns, as if materializing from the very thickness of the rock, figures began to appear. They emerged silently, with a heavy, springy tread that seemed to make the very stone vibrate under their feet. Dwarves. Not a handful of peaceful miners or smiths, but warriors. The grim guard of the deeps. Their armor, devoid of all elven refinement, was forged of dark, almost black in the dim light metal, covered with a thin yet fierce tracery of battle runes, and sat on their squat, powerful, rock-like figures like second skin. In their hands they held not axes or hammers, but long, heavy halberds with broad, polished to a bluish gleam blades, perfect for crushing combat in tight tunnels. Their thick beards, braided into complex, tight braids and bound with steel rings, almost completely hid their faces, leaving visible only deep-set eyes glittering from under frowning, bushy brows like coals in cave dark. There were many of them, very many. They emerged not in orderly columns, but occupied all exits, all possible retreat paths, surrounding the small elf company with a dense, silent, and menacing semicircle. Hundreds of eyes, full not of simple curiosity, but of cold, centuries accumulated wary suspicion, were fixed on the newcomers. The air instantly filled with the acrid smell of steel, volcanic oil, and strong, bitter sweat. From their close-knit ranks stepped forward one, whose simple mail was adorned only by a single polished silver rivet on the shoulder, but whose commanding bearing and heavy, piercing gaze, as if boring through, left no doubt of his authority. "What have you, children of forests and sun, forgotten in our stone bowels?" His voice was low, like distant subterranean rumble, but each word struck true as a honed blade. "And what wind, keepers of your trees, has blown you into our deaf halls? Speak, and speak only truth, for the next thing I hear will determine whether you leave this place on your own feet, or are carried out in or sacks." He did not shout, he did not threaten overtly, did not brandish weapons, but in his calm, enveloping, concentrated fury was such ancient, forged strength that even Aelor, accustomed to looking any danger in the face, felt an icy, unpleasant chill run down his spine. They stood, these 10 exhausted, long journey-torn elves, in the very center of a closed ring of steel and age-old suspicion, feeling on themselves the weight of hundreds of gazes, in which was not a drop of hospitality, only mute, centuries-old distrust and a readiness to flare at any moment into deadly action. Lyrael, suppressing in herself the first impulse to seize her weapon, took one slow and smooth step forward, keeping her gaunt hands palms outward, in plain sight, so as not to provoke the dwarves to instant reprisal. Her voice, when she finally spoke, sounded clear and distinct, but without the habitual elven melodic lilt. Warily, truthfully, and resignedly, as befitted such a fateful moment. "We come from the far west," she began, meeting directly and openly the heavy, lead-like gaze of the dwarven commander. "From Lendern. Our path lay over the very Dragon Ridge Pass, to emerge in the steppes, and then farther east, where our fate leads." She made a small but eloquent pause, letting them grasp the weight of her words. But the wind her gaze became absent for a moment, as if she again felt on her skin that all-crushing, icy squall that had driven them along the ledges. "A squalling wind drove us, like migratory birds, into one of the tunnels on the very slope. We thought only to wait out the foul weather, but lost our way in the stone labyrinths. Since then we have only sought a path upward, to the eastern slopes and sun. We did not seek your halls intentionally. We seek only an exit from this stone prison." She swept a slow, heavy gaze over the dwarves surrounding them from all sides, feeling on herself the weight of hundreds of distrustful eyes. Then again fixed it on the commander, straight into those narrow, drilling slits glittering from under overhanging brows. "We have not come with war or cunning in our hearts. We are simply lost travelers, fallen into misfortune not by our will. Our duty, our fate awaits us far in the east. And we ask of you, keepers of stone, only one thing: to show us the true road to the stepped air and sun." The dwarf commander, without taking his stone-like, inscrutable gaze from Lyrael, slowly, with a drawn-out, grating-on-stone sound, ran his broad, scarred palm over his thick beard braided into stiff, steel cable-like braids. The air in the cavernous hall, already stale and dusty, filled with tense, ringing silence 1,000 times thicker and heavier than any shout or threat. Hundreds of dwarf guards did not stir, did not flinch, but Lyrael felt with the skin of her back their collective, close-knit will, firm and unyielding as the very granite of their mountains. They were like ancient, wise, yet incredibly suspicious guardians of the deepest mountain bowels, and their mute, centuries-accumulated distrust hovered in the air, mingling with the smell of old stone, cooled metal, and sweat. "Lendern," the commander finally uttered, drawing out the word. And this name in their guttural dialect sounded like a low, disapproving, and sullen rumble. "For centuries you have sheltered behind your enchanted barrier, looking down on the rest of the world as on a bustling anthill at your feet, and now suddenly seek a path east. A strange, very strange time for such strolls, children of the forest. Very strange and suspicious." He took a heavy, authoritative step forward, and his massive shadow, cast by the dim light of the elven stones, covered Lyrael head to toe, like the wing of a colossal stone bird ready to close. "You speak of duty, of some path, but why would you, elves, whose souls are forever woven with the shade of ancient trees and the whisper of streams, leave your sacred woods and go into the dying, scorched steppes, to the east, from where nothing now comes, a dry wind with the bitter smell of ash? What duty, what force drives you through our ancestral lands, through the very womb of the Dragon Ridge, that you were even ready to perish in its stone depths rather than turn back to your safe groves?" His questions hung in the stale air, heavy, precise, and relentless as measured blows of a great smith's hammer on an anvil. Lyrael clearly understood. To simply say we seek answers or we wish to help was to say absolutely nothing, only to provoke new suspicion. The dwarves, these born realists raised in the strict, immutable laws of stone and molten metal, despised with all their soul vague hints and poetic metaphors. They needed minted, clear, coarse truth cast in such form as they could understand, touch, and assess with their straightforward minds. She slowly, almost painfully exhaled, gathering thoughts, gathering strength. In her memory, like lightning flashes, raced troubling images: the black crack in the white tree, the phantom bow beyond the thin barrier, falling, dying stars. And then she decided to bear before these stern, closed guardians of the mountains a part of her own elven pain, a part of that terrible truth that might, perhaps, become the only fragile bridge across the chasm of age-old distrust. "Our forest Lendern is dying," she said quietly, with icy, distinct clarity, and her words sounded with such bitter, exposed frankness that even the motionless, statue-like dwarf figures seemed to freeze even more, absorbing them, not from natural age, but from an alien, dark sickness that has stricken the very world. Its very foundation, on the white tree, in the very heart of Lendern, appeared a black, gaping crack. Stars fall from the sky like ripe apples. All of us saw terrible visions, The chaos that reigns in the east is not just another war of greedy men. It is only a symptom, an outward manifestation of that same world sickness. We do not stroll, do not seek adventure. We go to seek the cause of this universal decay, or those few who, like us, are not yet broken and are ready to oppose it. Our duty is not to watch indifferently from our refuges as the whole world slowly fades. Our duty is to try, at least to try, to save it, even if chances are almost none. Even if for this we must humble ourselves and ask help of those who long ago grew disillusioned with our words and our oaths. She fell silent, her breath rising heavily and raggedly under the simple cloak fabric. She had just laid out to them her deepest, her profound fear, her vulnerability, her last, desperate hope. Now all depended only on them, on whether they, in the depth of their stone hearts, could discern in her words a deceitful trick of desperation, or that very bitter, hard-won truth cast in pain and fear. The dwarf commander listened to her, not moving, not blinking an eye. His face, like a cliff carved from age-old granite, remained absolutely inscrutable and impassive. But somewhere deep in his eyes, in those narrow, piercing slits lost among wrinkles and skin folds, something barely perceptibly stirred, not warmth, not sudden sympathy, but perhaps a shadow of heavy, reluctant understanding. He remained silent so long that the ringing silence in the vast hall became almost physically unbearable, thick and viscous as molten, black resin. Finally, slowly, with a quiet but distinct creak of leather strap and clink of mail, he turned his powerful head and threw a short, expressive glance at one of his warriors standing slightly apart. That one, shortly, militarily nodding, immediately turned and silently disappeared into one of the nearest dark tunnels, his heavy but swift steps almost instantly fading in the cavernous, all-consuming depth. The sickness of the world, the commander finally spoke, and his voice, always firm, unexpectedly lost its former steely ruthlessness. Something deep, weary, and burdened with knowledge appeared in it. We dwarves know of it, of that very sickness. It began not yesterday. It began when the ancient union of 3 crowns was torn to shreds by the black treachery of men, and the arrogant indifference of elves once sworn to eternal unity. He stared at Lyrael again, and his gaze transformed, and though the probing sharpness in it did not fade, no trace of blind hostility remained, as if a mist-veiling vision had cleared, revealing a complex play of thoughts on his stern face. You speak of visions, of falling stars. Our seers have been visited for many moons now by the same dreams. A river of fire devouring the sky, and the great, all-consuming silence following it. A silence thicker and more terrible than any battle din. Perhaps your truth and ours are 2 facets of the same stone that fell from the heavens. From the dark of the tunnel thickening behind the warriors' backs came footsteps, heavy and measured, beating the rhythm of the underworld. The returning dwarf, his breathing quickened, his cloak dusted with fresh stone dust, said something short and quiet to the commander in their guttural, abrupt dialect, his words like the rolling of cobblestones. He listened, not stirring, only a shadow flitting across his eyes, and turned again to the elves. And in his silence was felt the weight of a decision made. The tunnel east, leading to the steppe foothills, exists, long unused and dangerous, of collapses. The stone there is old and unreliable, ready to crumble at too loud a word, but it is passable. We will escort you to its beginning. He paused, and the air thickened, and his next phrase sounded with the former, unbending sternness that froze the blood. But no, elves, this is no alliance. It is a reprieve. Proof of your words will be your deeds there, in the east, under the sun we seldom see. If you seek truth, find it. If you lie the mountains, remember. And we remember. Longer than your forests stand. He gave a short, abrupt command, and the circle of guards parted with practiced precision, forming a narrow corridor leading to the black maw of one of the passages. And this passage seemed less hospitable than the maw of an underground beast. The way was open, but the heavy burden of proof and the weight of mutual distrust, though temporarily set aside, lay on the elves' shoulders even more tangibly, almost palpably, as if they had been clad in invisible cloaks woven of lead and doubt. Their journey continued, but now it had not just a goal, but a first, fragile and silent pact with those they once considered forgotten brothers. A pact sealed not by oath but by a shared tremor before the coming. The road along which the dwarves led them differed sharply from their previous wanderings in the dark, where every step could be the last. The following weeks merged into a uniform succession of days and nights, measured only by guard changes and the endless, monotonous change of stone walls flowing past like a gloomy, frozen river. They walked not at random, but along a path known only to the chosen. But this made it neither easier nor shorter. The path's knowness did not cancel its merciless length. The dwarf guides, a small detachment chosen by the commander, moved ahead in silence, their heavy shod boots beating a clear, unhurried rhythm like a metronome counting the hours of this subterranean journey. And this thought echoed hollowly in the emptiness of the galleries. They did not look back, did not check if the elves followed in their straight, unbending backs. In their broad shoulders that seemed to prop up the very vault was unshakable certainty that those behind would follow them even to the end of ages. For they had no other choice. The tunnel was different to creation of mind and unbending will, not of blind natural forces. Its vaults were even and time-polished, as if carved by a giant chisel. And on the walls could be discerned traces of ancient masonry, seams drawn by a master's hand. The air here was drier and colder, carrying the musty smell of old stone and something else faint but persistent, acrid scent of sulfur and heated metal, as if the spirit of Ganabar's great forges, long extinguished, still haunted these deserted galleries like a ghost of bygone might. They walked in silence, and this silence was thick and weighty as the subterranean gloom. The dwarves were not talkative companions. Their silence was deep and self-sufficient, born in the bowels of stone. The elves, weary and exhausted to the very depths of their immortal souls, also did not strive for conversation, conserving meager strength. They walked, immersed in their thoughts, in the heavy burden of promise given in the hall under the probing gazes of the guards. Senil, leaning on Ryniel's shoulder, limped along. His recently broken arm was no longer bound with a tight bandage, but only ached slightly with sudden or awkward movement, and each step echoed in the bone with a dull pain reminding of any flesh transience. Aelor limped. His thigh wound had healed, leaving a livid, tight scar, but his gaze, fixed ahead into the dark, was full of the former unquenchable resolve burning in him like a tiny candle in a bottomless well. The long journey became for them a kind of purification, slow, agonizing, burning away all excess, but necessary as bitter medicine. By night, if this word had any meaning in the eternal dark, where time flowed like an underground river, they stopped in niches hewn into walls, or small halls with black, lifeless hearths. The dwarves first inspected them, feeling the walls with hard palms, and only then, nodding, allowed them to settle. They themselves posted sentries, changing silently, like shadows, and their motionless, frozen figures in the openings became an inseparable part of the stone landscape. Yet another bas-relief on the wall. After many days, having lost count and meaning in this timeless realm, the tunnel began slowly but steadily to ascend, and strain in the legs gave way to faint hope. The air grew a little less stale, its heaviness gradually eased, and one day Lyrael, suddenly stopping and holding her breath, caught a faint, barely perceptible current streaming from above, smelling not of sulfur and dust but of mountain wormwood, frost, and free wind. Timid hope, long forgotten, buried in the depths of the heart, stirred in her breast, a small and fragile sprout breaking through the stone of despair. And finally, when it seemed this endless path in pitch dark would never end, one of the dwarf guides, without turning or slowing his step, only sharply raised his short, muscular arm. They emerged into a small, low grotto littered with stone fragments and scree, as if after a long-ago collapse, and in its farthest end, where a solid wall should have been, gaped an irregular opening framed not by the ghostly light of dwarf lanterns or elven magic, but by the dim, real, tearfully familiar and alien simultaneously gray light of morning sky. The dwarf turned heavily to Lyrael, and in his eyes, deep-set under overhanging, hoary brows, lay not just weariness, but the centuries-old, stone-like weariness of all his folk. His thick beard was covered with finest crystals of rime from their own moist breath, condensing in the icy air at the exit. The way farther is blocked, but a crawl space for you, slender ones, exists, he uttered hollowly, without any intonation, indicating with a short motion of his head a dark breach in the stone pile. You can squeeze through, if you try. That is your steps. Our duty is fulfilled to the end. He did not wait for thanks, did not expect it, did not nod farewell. The dwarves, like stone boulders, turned with a heavy, measured grating of soles on scree and just as unhurriedly, without looking back, moved back into the waiting dark of the tunnel. Their stocky figures quickly dissolved, swallowed by gloom, leaving the elves in complete solitude on the very threshold of exit from the stone womb of the world, face to face with a new, unknown, desolate, and infinitely vast horizon. The elves, one after another, with difficulty crawled from the narrow stone mouth of the tunnel, shedding from their worn clothing sharp fragments of rock and sticky ancient dust, and froze, awkwardly squinting from the unfamiliar, eye-cutting light. They stood now on the eastern, gentle from the past foothills of the Dragon Ridge. Behind them, receding into leaden haze, towered stern, thinly forested slopes farther still. Many leagues away, somewhere remained Lendern, and ahead, as far as the eye could see ahead, to the very edge of the world, lay the steppes, boundless, living, breathing space stretching to the very merging of earth and sky on the horizon. Long grass, sere and hoary, swayed in the piercing wind in a continuous silver-brown wave, like the height of a colossal, sleeping beast. The air, incredibly pure, cold, and sharp after the stale, dead atmosphere of the underworld, intoxicated, dizzying, and stung the lungs like the strongest wine. It was thick with the pungent smells of wormwood, dry, cracked earth, and a barely perceptible yet relentless scent of distant smoke, a bitterish, alien taste of the world of men. Somewhere here, beyond this boundless sea of grass, began the blurred borders of the Empire of Elmar with its legendary capital Almarion, once great, uniting under its wing many peoples. Now, as rumors whispered and the bitter taste of ash on the wind confirmed, of its former greatness remained only smoldering coals fiercely fanned by winds of fratricidal strife. Their path lay straight through these dying lands, but not along beaten roads, not past nosy cities and sleeping villages. Lyrael slowly turned, sweeping along, attentive gaze over her companions frozen on the edge of the stone precipice. On their pale, journey-gaunt faces, for the first time in long weeks, turned toward the living sun. She clearly saw the same mixture of immense relief and new, deep, weary anxiety. They had exchanged one labyrinth for another, infinitely vaster. There, in the mountains, any danger was tangible, of falling stone, a gaping chasm, a monster from dark water. Here, in this steppe, it became phantom, invisible, diffused in the very air, in every gust of wind. Any lone smoke plume on the horizon, any chance-met traveler could, in an instant, turn into a mortal threat. "We cannot go openly, as before," she said quietly but firmly, and her words sounded to all as a final and irrevocable verdict. "The questions the dwarves asked us with such reluctance, men will ask with far greater greed and suspicion. From now on we need only shadow and absolute silence." Their path was yet very long, incredibly long. It lay now not under the weight of rockfalls, but through swaying grass, across sparse woodlands, along silent, mirror-like lakes, and over the gentle slopes of nameless hills. They were to become shadows, phantoms sliding along the very edge of an alien, hostile world. Their only compass was not a guiding star in the night, but a star that had fallen, a celestial torch extinguished before their eyes. There, to the far east, there, where, as Lyrael had seen, the first of the 12 great guardian stars had gone out, they held their course. They removed their gray, underworld bleached cloaks and, moved by a single, silent impulse, stepped into the tall, rustling grass. The steppe immediately accepted them, softly hiding their first traces with its resilient stems. The wind, that very one that brought from the east the bitter smell of ash, now embraced them, becoming their only invisible companion and simultaneous threat. The path under the open, all-seeing sky had begun, and every stirring blade of grass, every intermittent whisper of the wind reminded them of one thing. They were again in plain sight, but this time before the whole vast, unfamiliar, and indifferent world. Thus they walked day after day, tirelessly, keeping to the very shadow of the Dragon Ridge, whose colossal stone shoulders served them as both sole shelter and eternal silent reminder of the endured in the stone depths. By night they made camp in small, stunted groves or deep folds of terrain where they could not be spotted from the plain. They kindled the smallest fire, almost smokeless, from carefully gathered dry twigs and roots, and its trembling, tiny flame seemed to them unnaturally bright and provocative after the long, accustomed gloom of the underworld. In these long hours of nightly rest, when over the boundless steppe flashed alien, cold, and indifferent constellations, their thoughts involuntarily, against their will, flew far west, to the forever left sunlit groves of Lendern. They recalled now not loud heroic songs or great deeds of ancestors, but the simplest, most precious things, the taste of ripe sunberries gathered into wicker baskets, the thick scent of damp moss on stones after a warm summer rain, the quiet, lulling whisper of streams whose ancient, dawn-given names were dearer and closer to them than any proper names. Here, in this alien steppe, even the simplest food was different, foreign, and unfamiliar. They gathered tough yet edible roots and bitterish, astringent herbs that Iviel recognized by crumbs from vague memories of old, half-decayed scrolls. In the icy mountain streams that burst with a hollow roar from the very bowels of the ridge, and rushed toward the unseen from here Arendelle, they drew strength, recovering after long marches. These very streams, cold and swift, were their only living, visible link with home, with Lendern. The same water that washed the roots of white birches in the eternal forest originated here, at their very feet, in the stone crevices of the Dragon Ridge, and rushed westward. Like a message they could no longer send, their movement across the steppe was unhurried, extremely cautious, full of silent. Only to them understood hand signals and wary, constantly roving gazes across the horizon. They gradually learned to read this new element as they once read the forest. By the sudden flight of a flock of birds they determined the approach of an alien mounted detachment. By the direction and color of lone smoke plumes to the west, they guessed with frightening accuracy the location of human settlements to be avoided at all costs. Again, as in ancient times, they became children of nature, but this nature was different, stern, open to the gaze of the whole world, and merciless to those who could not completely dissolve in it, become a shadow. And with every new step east, with every night spent in complete solitude under indifferent alien and distant stars, their main goal, that very mysterious place where the first star had fallen, ceased to be an abstract prophecy from old books and became a heavy, real, almost tangible burden that inexorably drew them forward into the very heart of the approaching, yet unknown dark. Young Siniel, whose recently broken arm was no longer bound with a tight bandage but only ached slightly with sudden or awkward movement, sat by the dying night fire, peering eastward where over the dark, sky-merging line of the steppe hung a particularly bright, solitary, and unfamiliar star. Lyrael, he began quietly, almost a whisper, and his voice, strengthened and roughened over weeks of hard travel, still sounded uncertain and youthful. How long do you think we still have to go? When will this all end? His question hung in the cold night air, and all present by the fire, even the old, ever-busy Halder cleaning his large bow with a piece of coarse cloth, froze for a moment, as if awaiting an answer to this question with the same hidden, pent-up impatience. Lyrael did not answer him immediately. She too looked east, but her dark, piercing gaze was fixed far beyond any stars, into that very invisible point existing only in her memory and in the prophetic, cryptic words of old Quendeler. She slowly raised her slender but strong hand and pointed confidently forward, into the boundless, night gloom engulfed plain. We do not measure this path in days or leagues traveled, Siniel, she finally spoke, and her voice was even and calm, but in its depth was heard all the immeasurable weight of their long wanderings. We walk the invisible tracks of extinguished light, along the path of that very first star that fell from heaven to show us the only true road, and we will walk until we find the place of its last earthly rest, its grave in this world. She turned to him, and in her eyes, reflecting the fire's trembling tongues, was no shadow of empty consolation, only cold, hard won, and clear truth. It may take a month, or a year, perhaps even all our remaining, long lives, but every step, every morning brings us closer to the answer, to understanding why the heavens have changed, why stars fall, and what awaits our world now. After this sigh, she swept a slow gaze over all her companions sitting by the fire, their weary but unbroken, full of firm resolve faces. We do not simply walk to some place on a map. We walk toward an answer more important than our lives. Siniel silently, thoughtfully nodded, and his youthful gaze again fixed on the dark distance to the east. His simple question, how long, dissolved without trace in the night chill, yielding place in his soul to another, more important and frightening. What will we find at the end? And the answer to this new question lay not in words, but in their weary yet unceasing feet, in their backs not bent under the journey's weight, and in their silent, unanimous agreement to go on, through the boundless steppes, through time itself, toward that unknown awaiting them. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.